Chapter 15 of Fanny Herself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Chapter 15. The first week in June found her back in New York. That month of absence had worked a subtle change. The 2 weeks spent in crossing and recrossing had provided her with a letdown that had been almost jarring in its completeness. Everything competitive had seemed to fade away with the receding shore, and to loom up again only when the skyline became a thing of smoke banks, spires, and shafts. She had had only 2 weeks for the actual transaction of her business. She must have been something of a revelation to those Paris and Berlin manufacturers, accustomed though they were to the brisk and irresistible methods of the American businesswoman. She was, after all, absurdly young to be talking in terms of millions, and she was amazingly well dressed. This last passed unnoticed, or was taken for granted in Paris, but in Berlin, home of the frump and the flour sack figure, she was stared at appreciatively. Her business, except for 1 or 2 unimportant side lines, had to do with 2 factories on whose product the Haynes Cooper Company had long had a covetous eye. Quantity, as usual, was the keynote of their demand, and Fanny's task was that of talking in 6-figure terms to these conservative and over-wary foreign manufacturers. That she had successfully accomplished this, and that she had managed to impress them also with the important part that time and promptness in delivery played in a swift-moving machine like the Haynes Cooper concern, was due to many things beside her natural business ability. Self-confidence was there, and physical vigor and diplomacy. But above all was that sheer love of the game, the dramatic sense that enabled her to see herself in the part. That alone precluded the possibility of failure. She knew how youthful she looked, and how glowing. She anticipated the look that came into their faces when she left polite small talk behind and soared up into the cold, rarefied atmosphere of business. She delighted in seeing the admiring and tolerant smirk vanish and give way to a startled and defensive attentiveness. It might be mentioned that she managed, somehow, to spend almost half a day in Petticoat Lane and its squalid surroundings while in London. She actually prowled alone at night in the evil-smelling narrow streets of the poorer quarter of Paris, and how she escaped unharmed is a mystery that never bothered her, because she had never known fear of streets. She had always walked on the streets of Winnebago, Wisconsin, alone. It never occurred to her not to do the same in the streets of Chicago, or New York, or London, or Paris. She found Berlin, with its Adlon, its appalling cleanliness, its overfed populace, and its omnipresent Kaiser forever scudding up and down Unter den Linden in his chocolate-colored car, incredibly dull and unpicturesque. Something she had temporarily lost there in the busy atmosphere of the Haynes Cooper plant seemed to have returned miraculously. New York, on her return, was something of a shock. She remembered how vividly fresh it had looked to her on the day of that first visit, months before. Now, to eyes fresh from the crisp immaculateness of Paris and Berlin, Fifth Avenue looked almost grimy, and certainly shabby in spots. Ella Monahan, cheerful, congratulatory, beaming, met her at the pier, and Fanny was startled at her own sensation of happiness as she saw that pink, good-natured face looking up at her from the crowd below. The month that had gone by since she last saw Ella standing just so seemed to slip away and fade into nothingness. "I waited over a day," said Ella, "just to see you. My, you look grand. I know where you got that hat. Galeries Lafayette. How much?" "I don't expect you to believe it. 35 francs. $7. I couldn't get it for 25 here." They were soon clear of the customs. Ella had engaged a room for her at the hotel they always used. As they rode uptown together happily, Ella opened her bag and laid a little packet of telegrams and letters in Fanny's lap. "I guess Fenger's pleased all right, if telegrams mean anything. Not that I know they're from him, but he said—" But Fanny was looking up from one of them with a startled expression. "He's here. Fenger's here." "In New York?" asked Ella, rather dully. "Yes." She ripped open another letter. It was from Theodore. He was coming to New York in August. The Russian tour had been a brilliant success. They had arranged a series of concerts for him in the United States. He would give his concerto there. It was impossible in Russia, Munich, even Berlin, because it was distinctly Jewish in theme, as Jewish as the Kol Nidre and as somber. They would have none of it in Europe. Prejudice was too strong. But in America! He was happier than he had been in years. Olga objected to coming to America, but she would get over that. The little one was well, and she was learning to talk. Actually, they were teaching her to say Tante Fanny. "Well!" exclaimed Fanny, her eyes shining. She read bits of the letter aloud to Ella. Ella was such a satisfactory sort of person to whom to read a letter aloud. She exclaimed in all the right places. Her face was as radiant as Fanny's. They both had forgotten all about Fenger, their chief. But they had been in their hotel scarcely a half hour, and Ella had not done exclaiming over the bag that Fanny had brought her from Paris when his telephone call came. He wasted very little time on preliminaries. "I'll call for you at 4. We'll drive through the park and out by the river and have tea somewhere." "That would be wonderful. That is, if Ella's free, I'll ask her." "Ella?" "Yes, she's right here. Hold the wire, will you?" She turned away from the telephone to face Ella. "It's Mr. Fenger. He wants to take us both driving this afternoon. You can go, can't you?" "I certainly can," replied Miss Monahan, with what might have appeared to be undue force. Fanny turned back to the telephone. "Yes, thanks. We can both go. We'll be ready at 4." Fanny decided that Fenger's muttered reply couldn't have been what she thought it was. Ella busied herself with the unpacking of a bag. She showed a disposition to spoil Fanny. "You haven't asked after your friend, Mr. Hale. My land! If I had a friend like that!" "Oh, yes," said Fanny vaguely. "I suppose you and he are great chums by this time. He's a nice boy." "You don't suppose anything of the kind," Ella retorted crisply. "That boy, as you call him, and it isn't always the man with the biggest fist that's got the most fight in him, is about as far above me as She sat down on the floor, ponderously, beside the open bag, and gesticulated with a hairbrush, at loss for a simile, "as an eagle is above a waddling old duck. No, I don't mean that, either, because I never did think much of the eagle, morally. But you get me. Not that he knows it, or shows it. Hale, I mean. Lord, no. But he's got something kind of spiritual in him that makes you that way, too. He doesn't say much, either. That's the funny part of it. I do all the talking, seems, when I'm with him. But I find myself saying things I didn't know I knew. He makes you think about things you're afraid to face by yourself. Big things. Things inside of you." She fell silent a moment, sitting cross-legged before the bag. Then she got up, snapped the bag shut, and bore it across the room to a corner. "You know he's gone, I suppose." "Gone?" "To those mountains, or wherever it is he gets that look in his eyes from. That's my notion of a job. They'll let him go for the whole summer, roaming around being a naturalist, just so's he'll come back in the winter." "And the column?" Fanny asked. "Do they let that go, too?" "I guess he's going to do some writing for them up there. After all, he's the column. It doesn't make much difference where he writes from. Did you know it's being syndicated now all over the country? Well, it is. That's the secret of its success, I suppose. It isn't only a column written about New York for a New York paper. It's about everything, for anybody. It's the humanest stuff, and he isn't afraid of anything. New York's crazy about him. They say he's getting a salary you wouldn't believe. I'm a tongue-tied old fool when I'm with him. But then he likes to talk about you mostly, so it doesn't matter." Fanny turned swiftly from the dressing table, where she was taking the pins out of her vigorous, abundant hair. "What kind of thing does he say about me, Ellen girl? What kind of thing?" "Abuse, mostly. I'll be running along to my room now. I'll be out for lunch, but back at 4 for that airing Fenger's so wild to have me take. If I were you, I'd lie down for an hour till you get your land legs." She poked her head in at the door again. "Not that you look as if you needed it. You've got a different look, somehow. Kind of rested. After all, there's nothing like an ocean voyage." She was gone. Fanny stood a moment in the center of the room. There was nothing relaxed or inert about her. Had you seen her standing there, motionless, you would still have got a sense of action from her. She looked so splendidly alive. She walked to the window now and stood looking down upon New York in early June. Summer had not yet turned the city into a cauldron of stone and steel. From her height she could glimpse the green of the park, with a glint of silver in its heart that was the lake. Her mind was milling around aimlessly, in a manner far removed from its usual orderly functioning. Now she thought of Theodore, her little brother, his promised return. It had been a slow and painful thing, his climb. Perhaps if she had been more ready to help, if she had not always waited until he asked the aid that she might have volunteered. She thrust that thought out of her mind rudely and slammed the door on it. Fenger. He had said damn when she had told him about Ella, and his voice had been, well, she pushed that thought outside her mind too. Clarence Hale. He makes you think about the things you're afraid to face by yourself, big things, things inside of you. Fanny turned away from the window. She decided she must be tired after all, because here she was with everything to make her happy. Theodore coming home, her foreign trip a success, Ella and Fenger to praise her and make much of her, a drive and tea this afternoon. She wasn't above these creature comforts. And still she felt unexhilarated, dull. She decided to go down for a bit of lunch, and perhaps a stroll of 10 or 15 minutes, just to see what Fifth Avenue was showing. It was 1:30 when she reached that ordinarily well-regulated thoroughfare. She found its sidewalks packed solid, up and down, as far as the eye could see, with a quiet, orderly, expectant mass of people. Squads of mounted police clattered up and down, keeping the middle of the street cleared. Whatever it was that had called forth that incredible mass was scheduled to proceed uptown from far downtown, and that very soon. Heads were turned that way. Fanny wedged into the crowd, stood a tiptoe, but she could see nothing. It brought to her mind the circus day of her Winnebago childhood, with Elm Street packed with townspeople and farmers, all straining their eyes up toward Cherry Street, the first turn in the line of march. Then, far away, the blare of a band. "Here they come!" Just then, far down the canyon of Fifth Avenue, sounded the cry that had always swayed Elm Street, Winnebago. "Here they come!" "What is it?" Fanny asked a woman against whom she found herself close packed. "What are they waiting for?" "It's the suffrage parade," replied the woman. "The big suffrage parade. Don't you know?" "No, I haven't been here." Fanny was a little disappointed. The crowd had surged forward so that it was impossible for her to extricate herself. She found herself near the curb. She could see down the broad street now, and below 23rd Street it was a moving, glittering mass, pennants, banners, streamers flying. The woman next to her volunteered additional information. "The mayor refused permission to let them march, but they fought it, and they say it's the greatest suffrage parade ever held. I'd march myself, only—" "Only what?" "I don't know. I'm scared to, I think. I'm not a New Yorker." "Neither am I," said Fanny. Fanny always became friendly with the woman next to her in a crowd. That was her mother in her. One could hear the music of the band now. Fanny glanced at her watch. It was not quite 2. Oh, well, she would wait and see some of it. Her mind was still too freshly packed with European impressions to receive any real idea of the value of this pageant, she told herself. She knew she did not feel particularly interested, but she waited. Another surging forward. It was no longer, "Here they come," but "Here they are!" And here they were. A squad of mounted police on very prancy horses. The men looked very ruddy, and well set up and imposing. Fanny had always thrilled to anything in uniform, given sufficient numbers of them. Another police squad, a brass band on foot, and then in white on a snow-white charger, holding a white banner aloft, her eyes looking straight ahead of her, her face very serious and youthful, the famous beauty and suffrage leader Mildred Inness. One of the few famous beauties who actually was a beauty. And after that, women, women, women. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, a river of them flowing up Fifth Avenue to the park. More bands, more horses, women, women. They bore banners, this section, that section, artists, school teachers, lawyers, doctors, writers, women in college caps and gowns, women in white from shoes to hats, young women, girls, gray-haired women, a woman in a wheelchair, smiling. A man next to Fanny began to jeer. He was a red-faced young man with a coarse, blotchy skin and thick lips. He smoked a cigar, and called to the women in a falsetto voice. "Hello, Sadie!" he called. "Hello, kid!" And the women marched on, serious-faced, calm-eyed. There came floats, elaborate affairs, with girls in Greek robes. Fanny did not care for these. More solid ranks. And then a strange and pitiful and tragic and eloquent group. Their banner said, "Garment Workers, Infants' Wear Section." And at their head marched a girl, carrying a banner. I don't know how she attained that honor. I think she must have been one of those fiery, eloquent leaders in her factory clique. The banner she carried was a large one, and it flapped prodigiously in the breeze, and its pole was thick and heavy. She was a very small girl, even in that group of pale-faced, undersized, underfed girls. A Russian Jewess, evidently. Her shoes were ludicrous. They curled up at the toes, and the heels were run down. Her dress was a sort of parody on the prevailing fashion. But on her face, as she trudged along, hugging the pole of the great pennant that flapped in the breeze, was stamped a look. Well, you see that same look in some pictures of Joan of Arc. It wasn't merely a look. It was a story. It was tragedy. It was the history of a people. You saw in it that which told of centuries of oppression in Russia. You saw eager groups of student intellectuals, gathered in secret places for low-voiced, fiery talk. There was in it the unspeakable misery of Siberia. It spoke eloquently of pogroms, of massacres, of Kiev and its sister horror, Kishinev. You saw mean and narrow streets, and carefully darkened windows, and on the other side of those windows the warm yellow glow of the 7-branch Shabbos light. Above this there shone the courage of a race serene in the knowledge that it cannot die. And illuminating all, so that her pinched face, beneath the flapping pennant, was the rapt, uplifted countenance of the Crusader, there blazed the great glow of hope. This woman movement, spoken of so glibly as suffrage, was, to the mind of this overread, underfed, emotional, dreamy little Russian garment worker, the glorious means to a long-hoped-for end. She had idealized it with the imagery of her kind. She had endowed it with promise that it would never actually hold for her, perhaps. And so she marched on, down the great glittering avenue, proudly clutching her unwieldy banner, a stunted, grotesque, magnificent figure. More than a figure, a symbol. Fanny's eyes followed her until she passed out of sight. She put up her hand to her cheek, and her face was wet. She stood there, and the parade went on, endlessly it seemed, and she saw it through a haze. Bands, more bands, pennants, floats, women, women, women. "I always cry at parades," said Fanny to the woman who stood next to her, the woman who wanted to march but was scared to. "That's all right," said the woman. "That's all right." And she laughed, because she was crying too. And then she did a surprising thing. She elbowed her way to the edge of the crowd, past the red-faced man with a cigar, out to the street, and fell into line, marched on up the street, shoulders squared, head high. Fanny glanced down at her watch. It was 4:15. With a little gasp, she turned to work her way through the close-packed crowd. It was an actual physical struggle, from which she emerged disheveled, breathless, uncomfortably warm, and minus her handkerchief, but she had gained the comparative quiet of the side street, and she made the short distance that lay between the avenue and her hotel a matter of little more than a minute. In the hotel corridor stood Ella and Fenger, the former looking worried, the latter savage. "Where in the world?" began Ella. "Caught in the jam, and I didn't want to get out. It was glorious." She was shaking hands with Fenger, and realizing for the first time that she must be looking decidedly sketchy and that she had lost her handkerchief. She fished for it in her bag hopelessly when Fenger released her hand. He had not spoken. Now he said, "What's the matter with your eyes?" "I've been crying," Fanny confessed cheerfully. "Crying?" "The parade. There was a little girl in it." She stopped. Fenger would not be interested in that little girl. Now Clancy would have. But Ella broke in on that thought. "I guess you don't realize that out in front of this hotel there's a kind of glorified taxi waiting, with the top rolled back, and it's been there half an hour. I never expect to see the time when I could enjoy keeping a taxi waiting. It goes against me. I'm sorry, really. Let's go. I'm ready." "You are not. Your hair's a sight, and those eyes." Fenger put a hand on her arm. Go on up and powder your nose, Miss Brandeis, and don't hurry. I want you to enjoy this drive." On her way up in the elevator, Fanny thought, "He has lost his waistline. Now that couldn't have happened in a month. Queer I didn't notice it before. And he looks soft. Not enough exercise." When she rejoined them she was freshly bloused and gloved, and all traces of the telltale red had vanished from her eyelids. Fifth Avenue was impossible. Their car sped up Madison Avenue and made for the park. The plaza was a jam of tired marchers. They dispersed from there, but there seemed to be no end to the line that still flowed up Fifth Avenue. Fenger seemed scarcely to see it. He had plunged at once into talk of the European trip. Fanny gave him every detail, omitting nothing. She repeated all that her letters and cables had told. Fenger was more excited than she had ever seen him. He questioned, cross-questioned, criticized, probed, exacted an account of every conversation. Usually it was not method that interested him, but results. Fanny, having accomplished the thing she had set out to do, had lost interest in it now. The actual millions so glibly bandied in the Haynes Cooper plant had never thrilled her. The methods by which they were made possible had. Ella had been listening with the shrewd comprehension of one who admires the superior art of a fellow craftsman. "I'll say this, Mr. Fenger, if I could make you look like that, by going to Europe and putting it over those foreign boys, I'd feel I'd earned a year's salary right there, and quit. Not to speak of the cross-examination you're putting her through." Fenger laughed a little self-consciously. "It's just that I want to be sure it's real. I needn't tell you how important this trick is that Miss Brandeis has just turned." He turned to Fanny with a boyish laugh. "Now don't pose. You know you can't be as bored as you look." "Anyway," put in Ella briskly, "I move that the witness step down. She may not be bored, but she certainly must be tired, and she's beginning to look it. Just lean back, Fanny, and let the green of this park soak in. At that, it isn't so awfully green when you get right close, except that one stretch of meadow. Kind of ugly, Central Park, isn't it? Bare." Fanny sat forward. There was more sparkle in her face than at any time during the drive. They were skimming along those green-shaded drives that are so sophisticatedly sylvan. "I used to think it was bare, too, and bony as an old maid, with no soft, cuddly places like the parks at home, no gracious green stretches, and no rose gardens. But somehow it grows on you, the reticence of it, and that stretch of meadow near the mall, in the late afternoon, with the mist on it, and the sky faintly pink, and that electric sign, somebody's tires or other, winking on and off." "You're a queer child," interrupted Fenger. "As wooden as an Indian while talking about $1,000,000 deal, and lyrical over a combination of electric sign, sunset, and moth-eaten park. Oh, well, perhaps that's what makes you as you are." Even Ella looked a little startled at that. They had tea at Claremont, at a table overlooking the river and the Palisades. Fenger was the kind of man to whom waiters always give a table overlooking anything that should be overlooked. After tea they drove out along the river and came back in the cool of the evening. Fanny was very quiet now. Fenger followed her mood. Ella sustained the conversation, somewhat doggedly. It was almost 7 when they reached the plaza exit. And there Fanny, sitting forward suddenly, gave a little cry. "Why, they're marching yet," she said, and her voice was high with wonder. "They're marching yet. All the time we've been driving and teaing, they've been marching." And so they had. Thousands upon thousands, they had flowed along as relentlessly and seemingly as endlessly as a river. They were marching yet. For 6 hours the thousands had poured up that street, making it a moving mass of white. And the end was not yet. What pen and tongue and sense of justice had failed to do, they were doing now by sheer, crude force of numbers. The red-faced hooligan who had stood next to Fanny in the crowd hours before had long ago ceased his jibes and slunk away bored, if not impressed. After all, one might jeer at 10 or 50 or 100 women, or even 500, but not at 40,000. Their car turned down Madison Avenue, and Fenger twisted about for a last look at the throng in the plaza. He was plainly impressed. The magnitude of the thing appealed to him. To a Haynes Cooper trained mind, 40,000 women marching for whatever the cause must be impressive. 40,000 of anything had the respect of Michael Fenger. His eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "They seem to have put it over," he said. "And yet, what's the idea? Oh, I'm for suffrage, of course, naturally, and all those thousands of women in white. Still, a thing as huge as this parade has to be reduced to a common denominator to be really successful. If somebody could take the whole thing, boil it down, and make the country see what this huge demonstration stands for. Fanny leaned forward suddenly. Tell the man to stop. I want to get out. Fenger and Ella stared. What for? But Fenger obeyed. I want to get something at this stationer's shop. She had jumped down almost before the motor had stopped at the curb. But let me get it. No, you can't. Wait here. She disappeared within the shop. She was back in 5 minutes, a flat, loosely wrapped square under her arm. Cardboard, she explained briefly, in answer to their questions. Fenger, about to leave them at their hotel, presented his plans for the evening. Fanny, looking up at him, her head full of other plans, thought he looked and sounded very much like big business. And for the moment at least, Fanny Brandeis loathed big business, and all that it stood for. It's almost 7, Fenger was saying. We'll be rubes in New York this evening. You girls will just have time to freshen up a bit. I suppose you want to. And then we'll have dinner, and go to the theater, and to supper afterward. What do you want to see? Ella looked at Fanny, and Fanny shook her head. Thanks, you're awfully kind, but no. Why not? Demanded Fenger gruffly. Perhaps because I'm tired, and there's something else I must do. Ella looked relieved. Fenger's eyes bored down upon Fanny, but she seemed not to feel them. She held out her hand. You're going back tomorrow? Fenger asked. I'm not leaving until Thursday. Tomorrow, with Ella. Goodbye. It's been a glorious drive. I feel quite rested. You just said you were tired. The elevator door clanged, shutting out the sight of Fenger's resentful frown. He's as sensitive as a soubrette, said Ella. I'm glad you decided not to go out. I'm dead, myself. A kimono for the rest of the evening. Fanny seemed scarcely to hear her. With a nod, she left Ella and entered her own room. There she wasted no time. She threw her hat and coat on the bed. Her suitcase was on the baggage stand. She turned on all the lights, swung the closed suitcase up to the table, shoved the table against the wall, upended the suitcase so that its leather side presented a smooth surface, and propped a firm sheet of white cardboard against the impromptu rack. She brought her chair up close, fumbled in her bag for the pens she had just purchased. Her eyes were on the blank white surface of the paper. The table was the kind that has a subshelf. It prevented Fanny from crossing her legs under it, and that bothered her. While she fitted her pens and blocked her paper, she kept unbarking her shins in unconscious protest against the uncomfortable conditions under which she must work. She sat staring at the paper now, after having marked it off into blocks with a pencil. She got up and walked across the room aimlessly, and stood there a moment and came back. She picked up a thread on the floor, sat down again, picked up her pencil, rolled it a moment in her palms, then catching her toes behind either foreleg of her chair, in an attitude that was as workmanlike as it was ungraceful, she began to draw, nervously, tentatively at first, but gaining in firmness and assurance as she went on. If you had been standing behind her chair, you would have seen, emerging miraculously from the white surface under Fanny's pencil, a thin, undersized little figure in sleazy black and white, whose face, under the cheap hat, was upturned and rapturous. Her skirts were wind-blown, and the wind tugged, too, at the banner whose pole she hugged so tightly in her arms. Dimly you could see the crowds that lined the street on either side. Vaguely, too, you saw the faces and stunted figures of the little group of girls she led. But she, the central figure, stood out among all the rest. Fanny Brandeis the artist, and Fanny Brandeis the salesman, combined shrewdly to omit no telling detail. The wrong kind of feet in the wrong kind of shoes, the absurd hat, the shabby skirt, every bit of grotesquerie was there, serving to emphasize the glory of the face. Fanny Brandeis's face, as the figure grew, line by line, was a glorious thing, too. She was working rapidly. She laid down her pencil now and leaned back, squinting her eyes critically. She looked grimly pleased. Her hair was rather rumpled, and her cheeks very pink. She took up her pen now and began to ink her drawing with firm black strokes. As she worked, a little crow of delight escaped her, the same absurd crow of triumph that had sounded that day in Winnebago years and years before, when she, a schoolgirl in a red tam-o'-shanter, had caught the likeness of Schabelitz, the peasant boy, under the exterior of Schabelitz, the famous. There sounded a smart little double knock at her door. Fanny did not heed it. She did not hear it. Her toes were caught behind the chair legs again. She was slumped down on the middle of her spine. She had brought the table with its ridiculously up-ended suitcase very near, so that she worked with a minimum of effort. The door opened. Fanny did not turn her head. Ella Monahan came in, yawning. She was wearing an expensive-looking silk kimono that fell in straight, simple folds, and gave a certain majesty to her ample figure. "Well, what in the world?" she began, and yawned again, luxuriously. She stopped behind Fanny's chair and glanced over her shoulder. The yawn died. She craned her neck a little and leaned forward. And the little girl went marching by, in her cheap and crooked shoes, and her short and sleazy skirt, with the banner tugging, tugging in the breeze. Fanny Brandeis had done her with that economy of line and absence of sentimentality which is the test separating the artist from the draftsman. Silence, except for the scratching of Fanny Brandeis's pen. "Why, the poor little kike!" said Ella. Then, after a moment of silence, "I didn't know you could draw like that." Fanny laid down her pen. "Like what?" She pushed back her chair and rose stiffly. The drawing, still wet, was propped up against the suitcase. Fanny walked across the room. Ella dropped into her chair, so that when Fanny came back to the table it was she who looked over Ella's shoulder. Into Ella's shrewd and heavy face there had come a certain look. "They don't get a square deal, do they? They don't get a square deal." The two looked at the girl a moment longer in silence. Then Fanny went over to the bed and picked up her hat and coat. She smoothed her hair deftly, powdered her nose with care, and adjusted her hat at the smart angle approved by the Galerie Lafayette. She came back to the table, picked up her pen, and beneath the drawing wrote, in large print, "The Marcher." She picked up the drawing, still wet, opened the door, and with a smile at the bewildered Ella, was gone. It was after 8 o'clock when she reached the Star Building. She asked for Lasker's office, and sent in her card. Hale had told her that Lasker was always at his desk at 8. Now, Fanny Brandeis knew that the average young woman, standing outside the office of a man like Lasker, unknown and at the mercy of office boy or secretary, continues to stand outside until she leaves in discouragement. But Fanny knew, too, that she was not an average young woman. She had, on the surface, an air of authority and distinction. She had that quiet assurance of one accustomed to deference. She had youth and beauty and charm. She had a hat and suit bought in Paris, France, and a secretary is only human. Carl Lasker's private office was the bare, bright, newspaper-strewn room of a man who is not only a newspaper proprietor, but a newspaper man. There's a difference. Carl Lasker had sold papers on the street when he was 10. He had slept on burlap sacks, paper stuffed, in the basement of a newspaper office. Ink flowed with the blood in his veins. He could operate a press. He could manipulate a linotype machine, that almost humanly intelligent piece of mechanism. He could make up a paper single-handed, and had done it. He knew the newspaper game, did Carl Lasker, from the composing room to the street, and he was a very great man in his line. And so he was easy to reach and simple to talk to, as are all great men. A stocky man, decidedly handsome, surprisingly young, well-dressed, smooth-shaven, direct. Fanny entered. Lasker laid down her card. "Brandeis, that's a good name." He extended his hand. He wore evening clothes, with a white flower in his buttonhole. He must have just come in from a dinner, or he was to attend a late affair somewhere. Perhaps Fanny, taken aback, unconsciously showed her surprise, because Lasker grinned as he waved her to a chair. His quick mind had interpreted her thought. "Sit down, Miss Brandeis. You think I'm gotten up like a newspaper man in a Richard Harding Davis short story, don't you? What can I do for you?" Fanny wasted no words. "I saw the parade this afternoon. I did a picture. I think it's good. If you think so, too, I wish you'd use it." She laid it, face up, on Lasker's desk. Lasker picked it up in his two hands, held it off, and scrutinized it. All the drama in the world is concentrated in the confines of a newspaper office every day in the year, and so you hear very few dramatic exclamations in such a place. Men like Lasker do not show emotion when impressed. It is too wearing on the mechanism. Besides, they are trained to self-control. So Lasker said now, "Yes, I think it's pretty good, too." Then raising his voice to a sudden bellow, "Boy!" He handed the drawing to a boy, gave a few brief orders, and turned back to Fanny. "Tomorrow morning every other paper in New York will have pictures showing Mildred Innes, the beauty, on her snow-white charger, or Sophronisba A. Bannister, A.B., Ph.D., in her cap and gown, or Mrs. William Vanderwelt as Liberty. We'll have that little rat with the banner, and it'll get 'em. They'll talk about it." His eyes narrowed a little. "Do you always get that angle?" "Yes." "There isn't a woman cartoonist in New York who does that human stuff. Did you know that?" "Yes." "Want a job?" "No." His knowing eye missed no detail of the suit, the hat, the gloves, the shoes. "What's your salary now?" "10,000." "Satisfied?" "No." "You've hit the heart of that parade. I don't know whether you could do that every day or not, but if you struck 12 half the time it would be enough. When you want a job, come back." "Thanks," said Fanny quietly, and held out her hand. She returned in the subway. It was a Bronx train, full of sagging faces, lusterless eyes, grizzled beards, of heavy, black-eyed girls in soiled white shoes, of stoop-shouldered men poring over newspapers in Hebrew script, of smells and sounds and glaring light. And though tomorrow would bring its reaction, and common sense would have her again in its cold grip, she was radiant tonight, and glowing with the exultation that comes with creation. And over a voice within her was saying, "These are my people. These are my people." End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Fanny Herself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Chapter 16. The ship that brought Theodore Brandeis to America was the last of its kind to leave German ports for years. The day after he sailed from Bremen came the war. Fanny Brandeis was only one of the millions of Americans who refused to accept the idea of war. She took it as a personal affront. It was uncivilized. It was old-fashioned. It was inconvenient. Especially inconvenient. She had just come from Europe, where she had negotiated a $1 million deal. War would mean that she could not get the goods ordered. Consequently, there could be no war. Theodore landed the first week in August. Fanny stole 2 days from the ravenous Binns to meet him in New York. I think she must have been a very love-hungry woman in the years since her mother's death. She had never admitted it, but only emotions denied to the point of starvation could have been so shaken now at the thought of the feast before them. She had trained herself to think of him as Theodore the selfish, Theodore the callous, Theodore the voracious. "An unsuccessful genius," she told herself. "He'll be impossible. They're bad enough when they're successful." But now her eyes, her thoughts, her longings, her long-pent emotions were straining toward the boat whose great prow was looming toward her, a terrifying bulk. The crowd awaiting the ship was enormous. A dramatic enough scene at any time. The great Hoboken pier this morning was filled with an unrehearsed mob, anxious, thrilled, hysterical. The morning papers had carried wireless news that the ship had been chased by a French gunboat, and had escaped only through the timely warning of the Dresden, a German gunboat. That had added the last fill-up to an already tense situation. Tears were streaming down half the faces upturned toward the crowded decks, and from every side, "Do you see her?" "That's Jessie! There she is! Jessie!" "Heh, Jim, old boy, come on down." Fanny's eyes were searching the packed rails. "Ted!" she called, and choked back a sob. "Teddy!" Still she did not see him. She was searching, womanlike, for a tall, blondish boy, with a sulky mouth and humorous eyes, and an unruly lock of hair that would insist on escaping from the rest and straggling down over his forehead. I think she was even looking for a boy with a violin in his arms. A boy in knickers. Women lose all sense of time and proportion at such times. Still she did not see him. The passengers were filing down the gangplank now, rushing down as quickly as the careful hands of the crew would allow them, and hurling themselves into the arms of friends and family crowded below. Fanny strained her eyes toward that narrow passageway, anxious, hopeful, fearful, heartsick. For the moment Olga and the baby did not exist for her, and then she saw him. She saw him through an unimaginable disguise. She saw him and knew him in spite of the fact that the fair-haired, sulky, handsome boy had vanished, and in his place walked a man. His hair was close-cropped, German fashion, his face careworn and older than she had ever thought possible, his bearing, his features, his whole personality stamped with an unmistakable distinction. And his clothes were appallingly, inconceivably German. So she saw him, and he was her brother, and she was his sister, and she stretched out her arms to him. "Teddy!" She hugged him close, her face buried in his shoulder. "Teddy, you Spitzbub, you!" She laughed at that, a little hysterically. "Not that I know what a Spitzbub is, but it's the Germanest word I can think of." That shaven head, those trousers, that linen, the awful boots, the tie. "Oh, Teddy, and you're the Germanest thing I ever saw." She kissed him again, rapturously. He kissed her, too, wordlessly at first. They moved aside a little out of the crowd. Then he spoke for the first time. "God, I'm glad to see you, Fanny." There was tragedy, not profanation, in his voice. His hand gripped hers. He turned, and now, for the first time, Fanny saw that at his elbow stood a buxom peasant woman, evidently a nurse, and in her arms a child. A child with Molly Brandeis's mouth, and Ferdinand Brandeis's forehead, and Fanny Brandeis's eyes, and Theodore Brandeis's rose-leaf skin, and over and above all these, weaving in and out through the whole, an expression or cast, a vague, undefinable thing which we call a resemblance, that could only have come from the woman of the picture, Theodore Brandeis's wife, Olga. "Why, it's the baby!" cried Fanny, and swung her out of the nurse's protesting arms. Such a German-looking baby. Such an adorably German-looking baby. "Du Kleine, du!" Fanny kissed the rose-leaf cheek. "Du Süßes!" She turned suddenly to Theodore. "Olga! Where's Olga?" She did not come. Fanny tightened her hold of the squirming bundle in her arms. "Didn't come?" Theodore shook his head, dumbly. In his eyes was an agony of pain. And suddenly all those inexplicable things in his face were made clear to Fanny. She placed the little Mizzi in the nurse's arms again. "Then we'll go, dear. They won't be a minute over your trunks, I'm sure. Just follow me." Her arm was linked through Theodore's. Her hand was on his. Her head was up. Her chin was thrust out, and she never knew how startlingly she resembled the Molly Brandeis who used to march so bravely down Norris Street on her way to Brandeis's Bazaar. She was facing a situation, and she recognized it. There was about her an assurance, a composure, a blithe capability that imparted itself to the three bewildered and helpless ones in her charge. Theodore felt it, and the strained look in his face began to lift just a little. The heavy-witted peasant woman felt it and trudged along cheerfully. The baby in her arms seemed to sense it, and began to converse volubly and unintelligibly with the blue-uniformed customs inspector. They were out of the great shed in an incredibly short time. Fanny seemed equal to every situation. She had taken the tube to Hoboken, but now she found a commodious open car, and drove a shrewd bargain with the chauffeur. She bundled the three into it. Of the three, perhaps Theodore seemed to be the most bewildered and helpless. He clung to his violin and Fanny. "I feel like an immigrant," he said. "Fan, you're a wonder. You don't know how much you look and act like Mother. I've been watching you. It's startling." Fanny laughed and took his hand, and held his hand up to her breast, and crushed it there. "And you look like an illustration out of the Fliegende Blätter. It isn't only your clothes. Your face is German. As for Mizzi here—" She gathered the child in her arms again. "You've never explained that name to me. Why, by the way, Mizzi, of all the names in the world?" Theodore smiled a wry little smile. "Mizzi is named after Olga's chum. You see, in Vienna every other, well, chorus girl I suppose you'd call them, is named Mizzi, like all the Gladyses and Flossies here in America. Well, Olga's special friend Mizzi—" "I see," said Fanny quietly. "Well, anything's better than Fanny. Always did make me think of an old white horse." And at that the small German person in her arms screwed her mouth into a fascinating bunch, and then unscrewed it, and having made these preparations, said, "Tante Fanny, Chicago! Tante Fanny!" "Why, Missy Brandeis, you darling! Teddy, did you hear that? She said Tante Fanny and Chicago just as plainly." "Did I hear it? Have I heard anything else for weeks?" The plump person on the opposite seat, who had been shaking her head violently all this time, here threatened to burst if not encouraged to speak. Fanny nodded to her, whereupon the flood broke. "Wunderbar, nicht wahr? Ich küss die Hand, gnädiges Fräulein." She actually did it, to Fanny's consternation. "Ich hab ihr das gelernt, gnädige. Selbst. Ist es nicht ganz entzückend? Tante Fanny. Auch Chicago." Fanny nodded a number of times, first up and down, signifying assent, then sideways, signifying unbounded wonder and admiration. She made a gigantic effort to summon her forgotten German. "Was ist Ihre Name?" she managed to ask. "Ati." "Oh, my!" exclaimed Fanny weakly. "Mizzy and Ati. It sounds like the first act of The Merry Widow." She turned to Theodore. "I wish you'd sit back and relax, and if you must clutch that violin case, do it more comfortably. I don't want you to tell me a thing now. New York is ghastly in August. We'll get a train out of here tomorrow. My apartment in Chicago is cool and high and quiet. And the lake is in the front yard, practically. Tonight, perhaps, we'll talk about things. And oh, Teddy, how glad I am to see you, to have you, to—" She put out a hand and patted his thin cheek. "To touch you." And at that the man became a boy again. His face worked a moment, painfully, and then his head came down in her lap that held the baby. And so she had them both for a moment, one arm about the child, one hand smoothing the boy's close-cropped hair. And in that moment she was more splendidly maternal than either of the women who had borne these whom she now comforted. It was Fanny who attended to the hotel rooms, to the baby's comfort, to the railroad tickets, to the ordering of the meals. Theodore was like a stranger in a strange land. Not only that, he seemed dazed. "We'll have it out tonight," Fanny said to herself. "He'll never get that look off his face until he has told it all. I knew she was a beast." She made him lie down while she attended to schedules, tickets, berths. She was gone for 2 hours. When she returned she found him looking amused, terrified, and helpless, all at once, while 3 men reporters and 1 woman special writer bombarded him with questions. The woman had brought a staff artist with her, and he was now engaged in making a bungling sketch of Theodore's face, with its ludicrous expression. Fanny sensed the situation and saved it. She hadn't sold goods all these years without learning the value of advertising. She came forward now, graciously, but not too graciously. Theodore looked relieved. Already he had learned that one might lean on this sister, who was so capable, so bountifully alive. "Teddy, you're much too tired to talk. Let me talk for you." "My sister, Miss Brandeis," said Teddy, and waved a rather feeble hand in an inclusive gesture at the interrogatory 5. Fanny smiled. "Do sit down," she said, "all of you. Tell me, how did you happen to get on my brother's trail?" One of the men explained. "We had a list of ship's passengers, of course, and we knew that Mr. Brandeis was a German violinist. And then the story of the ship being chased by a French boat. We just missed him down at the pier." "But he isn't a German violinist," interrupted Fanny. "Please get that straight. He's American. He is the American violinist, or will be, as soon as his concert tour here is well started. It was Schabelitz himself who discovered my brother and predicted his brilliant career. Here." She had been glancing over the artist's shoulder. "Will you let me make a sketch for you, just for the fun of the thing? I do that kind of thing rather decently. Did you see my picture called The Marcher in the Star at the time of the suffrage parade in May? Yes, that was mine. Just because he has what we call a butcher haircut, don't think he's German, because he isn't. You wouldn't call Winnebago, Wisconsin, Germany, would you?" She was sketching him, swiftly, daringly, masterfully. She was bringing out the distinction, the suffering, the boyishness in his face, and toning down the queer little foreign air he had. Toning it, but not omitting it altogether. She was too good a showman for that. As she sketched, she talked, and as she talked she drew Theodore into the conversation deftly, and just where he was needed. She gave them what they had come for, a story, and a good one. She brought in Mizzy and Otti for color, and she saw to it that they spelled those names as they should be spelled. She managed to gloss over the question of Olga. Ill, detained, last minute. Too brave to sacrifice her husband's American tour. She finished her sketch and gave it to the woman reporter. It was an amazingly compelling little piece of work, and yet not so amazing, perhaps, when you consider the thing that Fanny Brandeis had put into it. Then she sent them away, tactfully. They left, knowing all that Fanny Brandeis had wanted them to know, guessing little that she had not wanted them to guess. More than that no human being can accomplish, without the advice of his lawyer. "Phew!" from Fanny, when the door had closed. "Gott in Himmel!" said Theodore. "I had forgotten that America was like that." "But America is like that. And, Teddy, we're going to make it sit up and take notice." At that Theodore drooped again. Fanny thought that he looked startlingly as she remembered her father had looked in those days of her childhood, when Brandeis's Bazaar was slithering downhill. The sight of him moved her to a sudden resolve. She crossed swiftly to him and put one heartening hand on his shoulder. "Come on, brother, out with it. Let's have it all now." He reached up for her hand and held it desperately. "Oh, Fan," began Theodore. "Fan, I've been through hell." Fanny said nothing. She only waited, quietly, encouragingly. She had learned when not to talk. Presently he took up his story, plunging directly into it, as though sensing that she had already divined much. "She married me for a living. You'll think that's a joke, knowing what I was earning there in Vienna, and how you and Mother were denying yourselves everything to keep me. But in a city that circulates a coin valued at a 20th of a cent, an American dollar looms up big. Besides, 2 of the other girls had got married. Good-for-nothing officers. She was jealous, I suppose. I didn't know any of that. I was flattered to think she'd notice me. She was awfully popular. She has a kind of wit. I suppose you'd call it that. The other girls were just coarse and heavy and, well, animal. You can't know the rottenness of life there in Vienna. Olga could keep a whole supper table laughing all evening. I can see now that that isn't difficult when your audience is made up of music-hall girls and stupid, bullet-headed officers with their damned high collars and their gold braid and their silly swords and their corsets and their glittering shoes and their miserable petty poverty beneath all the show. I thought I was a lucky boy. I'd have pitied everybody in Winnebago, if I'd ever thought of anybody in Winnebago. I never did, except once in a while of you and Mother when I needed money. I kept on with my music. I had sense enough left for that. Besides, it was a habit by that time. Well, we were married." He laughed an ugly, abrupt little laugh that ended in a moan, and turned his head and buried his face in Fanny's breast. And Fanny's arm was there, about his shoulder. "Fanny, you don't I can't." He stopped. Another silence. Fanny's arm tightened its hold. She bent and kissed the top of the stubbly head, bowed so low now. "Fan, do you remember that woman in the Three Musketeers? The hellish woman that all men loved and loathed? Well, Olga's like that. I'm not whining. I'm not exaggerating. I'm just trying to make you understand. And yet I don't want you to understand. Only you don't know what it means to have you to talk to have someone who—" He clutched her hand fearfully. "You do love me, don't you, Fanny? You do, don't you, sis?" "More than anyone in the world," Fanny reassured him quietly. "The way Mother would have if she had lived." A sigh escaped him at that, as though a load had lifted from him. He went on presently. "It would have been all right if I could have earned just a little more money." Fanny shrank at that and shut her eyes for a sick moment. "But I couldn't. I asked her to be patient. But you don't know the life there. There is no real home life. They live in the cafes. They go there to keep warm in the winter, and to meet their friends and gossip, and drink that eternal coffee. And every coffee house, there are thousands, is a rendezvous. We had 2 rooms, comfortable ones for Vienna, and I tried to explain to her that if I could work hard and get into concert and keep at the composing, we'd be rich some day, and famous, and happy, and she'd have clothes and jewels. But she was too stupid or too bored. Olga is the kind of woman who only believes what she sees. Things got worse all the time. She had a temper. So have I, or I used to have. But when hers was aroused it was horrible. Words that unspeakable words. And one day she taunted me with being, with my race. The first time she called me that, I felt that I must kill her. That was my mistake. I should have killed her, and I didn't." "Teddy boy, don't, brother. You're tired. You're excited and worn out." "No, I'm not. Just let me talk. I know what I'm saying. There's something clean about killing." He brooded a moment over that thought. Then he went on, doggedly, not raising his voice. His hands were clasped loosely. "You don't know about the intolerance and the anti-Semitism in Prussia, I suppose. All through Germany, for that matter. In Bavaria, it's bitter. That's one reason why Olga loathed Munich so. The queer part of it is that all that opposition seemed to fan something in me, something that had been smoldering for a long time." His voice had lost its dull tone now. It had a new timbre. And as he talked he began to interlard his English with bits of German, the language to which his tongue had accustomed itself in the past 10 years. His sentences, too, took on a German construction from time to time. He was plainly excited now. "My playing began to improve. There would be a ghastly scene with Olga, sickening, degrading. Then I would go to my work, and I would play, but magnificently. I tell you, it would be playing. I know. To fool myself, I know better. One morning, after a dreadful quarrel, I got the idea for the concerto and the psalms. Jewish music, as Jewish as the Kol Nidre. I wanted to express the passion and fire and history of a people. My people. Why was that? Tell me. Selbst weiß ich nicht. I felt if I could put into it just the millionth part of their humiliation and their glory and their tragedy and their triumph and their sorrow and their grandeur, their persecution, their Weltschmerz, Volksschmerz, and through it all, weaving in and out, one great underlying motif, indestructibility, the great cry which says, we cannot be destroyed." He stood up uncertainly. His eyes were blazing. He began to walk up and down the luxurious little room. Fanny's eyes matched his. She was staring at him, fascinated, trembling. She moistened her lips a little with her tongue. "And you've done it? Teddy, you've done that?" Theodore Brandeis stood up, very straight and tall. "Yes," he said simply. "Yes, I've done that." She came over to him then and put her 2 hands on his shoulders. "Ted, dear, will you ever forgive me? I'll try to make up for it now. I didn't know. I've been blind. Worse than blind. Criminal." She was weeping now, broken-heartedly, and he was patting her with little comforting love pats and whispering words of tenderness. "Forgive you? Forgive you what?" "The years of suffering. The years you've had to spend with her. With that horrible woman." "Don't." He sucked his breath between his teeth. His face had gone haggard again. Fanny, direct as always, made up her mind that she would have it all. And now. "There's something you haven't told me. Tell me all of it. You're my brother, and I'm your sister. We're all we have in the world." And at that, as though timed by some miraculous and supernatural stage manager, there came a cry from the next room. A sleepy, comfortable, imperious little cry. Mizzi had awakened. Fanny made a step in the direction of the door. Then she turned back. "Tell me why Olga didn't come. Why isn't she here, with her husband and baby?" "Because she's with another man." "Another?" "It had been going on for a long time. I was the last to know about it. It's that way always, isn't it? He's an officer. A fool. He'll have to take off his silly corsets now, and his velvet collar and his shiny boots, and go to war. Damn him. I hope they'll kill him with 100 bayonets, one by one, and leave him to rot on the field." She had been fooling me all the time, and they had been laughing at me, the 2 of them. I didn't find it out until just before this American trip. And when I confronted her with it, she laughed in my face. She said she hated me. She said she'd rather starve than leave him to come to America with me. She said I was a fiddling fool. He was trembling and sick with the shame of it. God, I can't tell you the things she said. She wanted to keep Mizzi. Isn't that strange? She loves the baby. She neglects her and spoils her, and once I saw her beat her in a rage. But she says she loves my Mizzi, and I believe she does in her own dreadful way. I promised her, and lied to her, and then I ran away with Mizzi and her nurse." "Oh, I thank God for that!" Fanny cried. "I thank God for that!" "And now, Teddy boy, we'll forget all about those miserable years. We'll forget all about her and the life she led you. You're going to have your chance here. You're going to be repaid for every minute of suffering you've endured. I'll make it up to you. And when you see them applauding you, calling for you, adoring you, all those hideous years will fade from your mind, and you'll be Theodore Brandeis, the successful, Theodore Brandeis, the gifted, Theodore Brandeis, the great. You need never think of her again. You'll never see her again. That beast! That woman!" And at that, Theodore's face became distorted and dreadful with pain. He raised two impotent, shaking arms high above his head. "That's just it! That's just it! You don't know what love is. You don't know what hate is. You don't know how I hate myself, loathe myself. She's all that's miserable, all that's unspeakable, all that's vile. And if she called me today, I'd come. That's it." He covered his shamed face with his two hands, so that the words came from him slobberingly, sickeningly. "I hate her! I hate her! And I want her! I want her! I want her!" End of chapter 16. Chapter 17, Part 1, of Fanny Herself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Part 1 of Chapter 17. If Fanny Brandeis, the deliberately selfish, the calculatingly ambitious, was aghast at the trick fate had played her, she kept her thoughts to herself. Knowing her, I think she must have been grimly amused at finding herself saddled with a helpless baby, a bewildered peasant woman, and an artist brother, both helpless and bewildered. It was out of the question to house them in her small apartment. She found a furnished apartment near her own and installed them there, with a working housekeeper in charge. She had a gift for management, and she arranged all these details with a brisk capability that swept everything before it. A sunny bedroom for Mizzy, but then a bright living room, too, for Theodore's hours of practice. No noise. Chicago's roar maddened him. Otti shied at every new contrivance that met her eye. She had to be broken into elevators, electric switches, hot and cold faucets, radiators. "No apartment ever built could cover all the requirements," Fanny confided to Fenger after the first harrowing week. "What they really need is a combination palace, houseboat, sanatorium, and creche." "Look here," said Fenger, "if I can help, why—" A sudden thought struck him. "Why don't you bring 'em all down to my place in the country? We're not there half the time. It's too cool for my wife in September. Just the thing for the child, and your brother could fiddle his head off." The Fengers had a roomy, wide verandaed house near Lake Forest, one of the many places of its kind that dot the section known as the North Shore. Its lawn sloped gently down to the water's edge. The house was gay with striped awnings and scarlet geraniums and chintz-covered chairs. The bright, sparkling, luxurious little place seemed to satisfy a certain beauty sense in Fenger, as did the etchings on the walls in his office. Fanny had spent a week-end there in July with 3 or 4 other guests, including Fascinating Facts. She had been charmed with it, and had announced that her energies thereafter would be directed solely toward the possession of just such a house as this, with a lawn that was lipped by the lake, awnings and geraniums to give it a French café air, books and magazines enough to belie that. "And I'll always wear white," she promised gaily, "and there'll be pictures on every table, frosty on the outside and minty on the inside, and you're all invited." They had laughed at that, and so had she, but she had been grimly in earnest just the same. She shook her head now at Fenger's suggestion. "Imagine Mrs. Fenger's face at sight of Mizzy, and Theodore with his violin, and Otti with her shawls and paraphernalia. Though," she added seriously, "it's mighty kind of you, and generous, and just like a man." "It isn't kindness nor generosity that makes me want to do things for you." "Modest," murmured Fanny wickedly, "as always." Fenger bent his look upon her. "Don't try the ingenue on me, Fanny." Theodore's manager, Kurt Stein, was to have followed him in 10 days. The war changed that. The war was to change many things. Fanny seemed to sense the influx of musicians that was to burst upon the United States following the first weeks of the catastrophe, and she set about forestalling it. Advertising. That was what Theodore needed. She had faith enough in his genius. but her business sense told her that this genius must be enhanced by the proper setting. She set about creating this setting. She overlooked no chance to fix his personality in the kaleidoscopic mind of the American public, or as much of it as she could reach. His publicity man was a dignified German American, whose methods were legitimate and uninspired. Fanny's enthusiasm and superb confidence in Theodore's genius infected Fenger, Fascinating Facts, even Nathan Haynes himself. Nathan Haynes had never posed as a patron of the arts, in spite of his fantastic millions. But by the middle of September there were few of his friends, or his wife's friends, who had not heard of this Theodore Brandeis. In Chicago, Illinois, no one lives in houses, it is said, except the city's old families and new millionaires. The rest of the vast population is flat-dwelling. To say that Nathan Haynes' spoken praise reached the city's house-dwellers would carry with it a significance plain to any Chicagoan. As for Fanny's method, here is a typical example of her somewhat crude effectiveness in showmanship. Otti had brought with her from Vienna her native peasant costume. It is a costume seen daily in the Austrian capital, on the Ring, in the Stade Park, wherever Viennese nurses convene with their small charges. To the American eye it is a musical comedy costume, picturesque, bouffant, amazing. Your Austrian takes it quite for granted. Regardless of the age of the nurse, the skirt is short, coming a few inches below the knees, and built like a lampshade, in color usually a bright scarlet, with rows of black velvet ribbon at the bottom. Beneath it are worn skirts and skirts and skirts, so that the opera buffet effect is complete. The bodice is black velvet, laced over a chemise of white. The headgear is a sword winged affair of starchly stiffed white, that is a pass between the Breton peasant woman's cap and an aeroplane. Black stockings and slippers finish the costume. Otti and Mizzi spent the glorious September days in Lincoln Park, Otti garbed in staid American stripes and apron, Mizzi resplendent in smartest of children's dresses, provided for her lavishly by her aunt. Her fat and dimpled hands smoothed the blue or pink or white folds with a complacency astonishing in one of her years. That's her mother in her, Fanny thought. One rainy autumn day Fanny entered her brother's apartment to find Otti resplendent in her Viennese nurse's costume. Mizzi had been cross and fretful, and the sight of the familiar scarlet and black and white and the great winged cap seemed to soothe her. "Otti!" Fanny exclaimed. "You gorgeous creature! What is it? A dress rehearsal?" Otti got the import, if not the English. "So gehen wir in Wien," she explained, and struck a killing pose. "Everybody? All the nurses? Alle?" "Aber, sure." Otti displayed her half-dozen English words wherever possible. Fanny stared a moment. Her eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Tomorrow's Saturday," she said in German. "If it's fair and warm, you put on that costume and take Mizzi to the park. Certainly the animal cages if you want to. If anyone annoys you, come home. If a policeman asks you why you are dressed that way, tell him it is the costume worn by nurses in Vienna. Give him your name. Tell him who your master is. If he doesn't speak German, and he won't in Chicago, someone will translate for you." Not a Sunday paper in Chicago that did not carry a startling picture of the resplendent Otti and the dimpled and smiling Mizzi. The omnipresent staff photographer seemed to sniff his victim from afar. He pounced on Theodore Brandeis's baby daughter, accompanied by her Viennese nurse, in costume, and he played her up in a Sunday special that was worth thousands of dollars, Fanny assured the bewildered and resentful Theodore, as he floundered wildly through the billowing waves of the Sunday newspaper flood. Theodore's first appearance was to be in Chicago as soloist with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra in the season's opening program in October. Any music-wise Chicagoan will tell you that the Chicago Symphony Orchestra is not only a musical organization functioning marvelously when playing Beethoven, it is an institution. Its patrons will admit the existence, but not the superiority of similar organizations in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. On Friday afternoons during the season, Orchestra Hall, situate on Michigan Boulevard, holds more pretty girls and fewer men than one might expect to see at any one gathering other than, perhaps, a wholesale debutante tea crush. A Friday afternoon ticket is as impossible of attainment for one not a subscriber as a seat in heaven for a sinner. Saturday night's audience is staider, more masculine, less staccato. Gallery, balcony, parquet, it represents the city's best. Its men prefer Beethoven to Berlin. Its women could wear pearl necklaces, and don't. Between the audience and the solemn black and white rows on the platform there exists an entente cordiale. The Concertmeister bows to his friend in the third row, as he tucks his violin under his chin. The fifth row aisle smiles and nods to the sausage-fingered cellist. Fritz is playing well tonight. In a rarefied form, it is the atmosphere that existed between audience and players in the days of the old and famous Daily Stock Company. Such was the character of the audience Theodore was to face on his first appearance in America. Fanny explained its nature to him. He shrugged his shoulders in a gesture as German as it was expressive. Theodore seemed to have become irrevocably German during the years of his absence from America. He had a queer stock of little foreign tricks. He lifted his hat to men acquaintances on the street. He had learned to smack his heels sharply together, and to bow stiffly from the waist, and to kiss the hand of the matrons, and they adored him for it. He was quite innocent of pose in these things. He seemed to have imbibed them, together with his queer German haircut and his incredibly German clothes. Fanny allowed him to retain the bow and the courtly hand-kiss, but she insisted that he change the clothes and the haircut. "You'll have to let it grow, Ted. I don't mean that I want you to have a mane like Ysaye, but I do think you ought to discard that convict cut. Besides, it isn't becoming, and if you're going to be an American violinist you'll have to look it, with a foreign finish." He let his hair grow. Fanny watched with interest for the appearance of the unruly lock which had been wont to straggle over his white forehead in his schoolboy days. The new and well-cut American clothes effected surprisingly little change. Fanny, surveying him, shook her head. "When you stepped off the ship you looked like a German in German clothes. Now you look like a German in American clothes. I don't know. I do believe it's your face, Ted. I wouldn't have thought that 10 years or so in any country could change the shape of one's nose and mouth and cheekbones. Do you suppose it's the umlauts?" "Cut it out," laughed Ted, that being his idea of modern American slang. He was fascinated by these crisp phrases, but he was 10 years or so behind the times, and he sometimes startled his hearers by an exhibition of slang so old as to be almost new. It was all the more startling in contrast with his conversational English, which was as carefully correct as a born German's. As for the rest, it was plain that he was interested, but unhappy. He practiced for hours daily. He often took Mizzi to the park, and came back storming about the dirt, the noise, the haste, the rudeness, the crowds, the mismanagement of the entire city. Dummheit, he called it. They profaned the lake. They allowed the people to trample the grass. They threw papers and banana skins about. And they wasted. His years in Germany had taught him to regard all these things as sacrilege, and the last as downright criminal. He was lonesome for his Germany. That was plain. He hated it and loved it, much as he hated and loved the woman who had so nearly spoiled his life. The maelstrom known as the southwest corner of State and Michigan streets appalled him. "Gott!" he exclaimed. "Es ist unglaublich! Aber ganz unglaublich! Ich werd bald verrückt!" He somehow lapsed into German when excited. Fanny took him to the Haynes Cooper plant one day, and it left him dazed and incredulous. She quoted millions at him. He was not interested. He looked at the office workers, the mail-room girls, and shook his head dumbly. They were using bicycles now, with a bundle rack in the front in the vast stockrooms, and the roller skates had been discarded as too slow. The stock boys skimmed around corners on these lightweight bicycles, up one aisle and down the next, snatching bundles out of bins, shooting bundles into bins, as expertly as players in a gymkhana. Theodore saw the uncanny rapidity with which the letter-opening machines did their work. He watched the great presses that turned out the catalog whose message meant millions. He sat in Fenger's office and stared at the etchings, and said, "Certainly," with politeness, when Fenger excused himself in the midst of a conversation to pick up the telephone receiver and talk to their shoe factory in Maine. He ended up finally in Fanny's office, no longer a dingy and undesirable corner, but a quietly brisk center that sent out vibrations over the entire plant. Slosson, incidentally, was no longer of the infant's wear. He had been transferred to a subordinate position in the grocery section. "Well," said Fanny, seating herself at her desk and smiling radiantly upon her brother. "Well, what do you think of us?" And then Theodore Brandeis, the careless, the selfish, the blind, said a most amazing thing. "Fanny, I'll work. I'll soon get some of these millions that are lying about everywhere in this country. And then I'll take you out of this, I promise." Fanny stared at him, a picture of ludicrous astonishment. "Why, you talk as if you were sorry for me." "I am, dear. God knows I am. I'll make it up to you, somehow." It was the first time in all her dashing and successful career that Fanny Brandeis had felt the sting of pity. She resented it hotly, and from Theodore, the groper, the... But at any rate, something within her said, he has always been true to himself. Theodore's manager arrived in September on a Holland boat, on which he had been obliged to share a stuffy inside cabin with 3 others. Kurt Stein was German born, but American bred, and he had the American love of luxurious travel. He was still testy when he reached Chicago and his charge. "How goes the work?" he demanded at once of Theodore. He eyed him sharply. "That's better. You have lost some of the look you had when you left Vienne. The ladies would have liked that look here in America, but it is bad for the work." He took Fanny aside before he left. His face was serious. It was plain that he was disturbed. "That woman," he began. "Pardon me, Mrs. Brandeis. She came to me. She says she's starving. She is alone there in Vienna. Well, she is alone. The war is everywhere. They say it will last for years. She wept and pleaded with me to take her here." "No!" cried Fanny. "Don't let him hear it. He mustn't know. Yes, I know. She's a paradox, that woman. I tell you, she almost prevailed on me. There is something about her, something that repels and compels." That struck him as being a very fine phrase indeed, and he repeated it appreciatively. "I'll send her money, somehow," said Fanny. "Yes, but they say that money is not reaching them over there. I don't know what becomes of it. It vanishes." He turned to leave. "Oh, a message for you. On my boat was Schabelitz. It looks very much as if his great fortune, the accumulation of years, would be swept away by this war. Already they are tramping up and down his lands in Poland. His money, much of it, is invested in great hotels in Poland and Russia, and they are using them for barracks and hospitals." "Schabelitz! You mean a message for Theodore? From him? That's wonderful." "For Theodore, and for you, too." "For me? I made a picture of him once when I was a little girl. I didn't see him again for years. Then I heard him play. It was on his last tour here. I wanted to speak to him, but I was afraid, and my face was red with weeping." "He remembers you, and he means to see Theodore and you. He can do much for Theodore in this country, and I think he will. His message for you was this: tell her I still have the picture that she made for me with the jack-in-the-box in my hand, and that look on my face. Tell her I have often wondered about that little girl in the red cap and the black curls. I've wondered if she went on catching that look back of people's faces. If she did, she should be more famous than her brother." "He said that? About me?" "I am telling you as nearly as I can. He said, tell her it was a woman who ruined Bauer's career, and caused him to end his days as a music teacher in Gott, I can't remember the name of that town." "Winnebago." "Winnebago, that was it. Tell her not to let the brother spoil his life that way. So, that is the message. He said you would understand." Theodore's face was ominous when she returned to him, after Stein had left. "I wish you and Stein wouldn't stand out there in the hall, whispering about me as if I were an idiot patient. What were you saying?" "Nothing, Ted, really." He brooded a moment. Then his face lighted up with a flash of intuition. He flung an accusing finger at Fanny. "He has seen her." "Ted, you promised." "She's in trouble, this war, and she hasn't any money. I know. Look here, we've got to send her money. Cable it." "I will. Just leave it all to me." "If she's here, in this country, and you're lying to me—" "She isn't. My word of honor, Ted." He relaxed. Life was a very complicated thing for Fanny these days. Ted was leaning on her. Mizzi, Oddie, and now Fenger. Nathan Haynes was poking a disturbing finger into that delicate and complicated mechanism of system which Fenger had built up in the Haynes Cooper plant. And Fenger, snarling, was trying to guard his treasure. He came to Fanny with his grievance. Fanny had always stimulated him, reassured him, given him the mental readjustment that he needed. He strode into her office one morning in late September. Ordinarily he sent for her. He stood by her desk now, a sheaf of papers in his hand, palpably stage props, and lifted significant eyebrows in the direction of the stenographer busy at her typewriter in the corner. "You may leave that, Miss Mahan," Fanny said. Miss Mahan, a comprehending young woman, left it, and the room as well. Fenger sat down. He was under great excitement, though he was quite controlled. Fanny, knowing him, waited quietly. His eyes held hers. "It's come," Fenger began. "You know that for the last year Haynes has been milling around with a herd of sociologists, philanthropists, and students of economics. He had some scheme in the back of his head, but I thought it was just another of his impractical ideas. It appears that it wasn't. Between the lot of them they've evolved a savings and profit-sharing plan that's founded on a kind of practical, universal brotherhood dream. Haynes' millions are bothering him. If they actually put this thing through, I'll get out. It'll mean that everything I've built up will be torn down. It'll mean that any $6-a-week girl—" "As I understand it," interrupted Fanny, "it will mean that there will be no more $6-a-week girls." "That's it. And let me tell you, once you get the ignorant, unskilled type to be believing they're actually capable of earning decent money, actually worth something, they're worse than useless. They're dangerous." "You don't believe that." "I do." "But it's a theory that belongs to the Dark Ages. We've disproved it. We've got beyond that." "Yes, so was war. We'd got beyond it. But it's here. I tell you there are only two classes, the governing and the governed. That has always been true. It always will be. Let the socialist rave. It has never got them anywhere. I know. I come from the mucker class myself. I know what they stand for. Boost them and they'll turn on you. If there's anything in any of them, he'll pull himself up by his own bootstraps." "They're not all potential Fengers." "Then let 'em stay where they are." Fanny's pencil was tracing and retracing a tortured and meaningless figure on the paper before her. "Tell me, do you remember a girl named Sarah Sapinsky?" "Never heard of her." "That's fitting. Sarah Sapinsky was a very pretty, very dissatisfied girl who was a slave to the bundle chute. One day there was a period of 2 seconds when a bundle didn't pop out at her, and she had time to think. Anyway, she left. I asked about her. She's on the streets." "Well?" "Thanks to you and your system." "Look here, Fanny, I didn't come to you for that kind of talk. Don't, for heaven's sakes, give me any sociological drivel today. I'm not here just to tell you my troubles. You know what my contract is here with Haynes Cooper, and you know the amount of stock I hold. If this scheme of Haynes goes in, I go out, voluntarily, but at my own price. The Haynes Cooper plant is at the height of its efficiency now." He dropped his voice. "But the mail order business is in its infancy. There's no limit to what can be done with it in the next few years. Understand? Do you get what I'm trying to tell you?" He leaned forward, tense, and terribly in earnest. Fanny stared at him. Then her hand went to her head in a gesture of weariness. "Not today, please, and not here. Don't think I'm ungrateful for your confidence. But this month has been a terrific strain. Just let me pass the 15th of October. Let me see Theodore on the way." Fenger's fingers closed upon her wrist. Fanny got to her feet angrily. They glared at each other a moment. Then the humor of the picture they must be making struck Fanny. She began to laugh. Fenger's glare became a frown. He turned abruptly and left the office. Fanny looked down at her wrist ruefully. 4 circlets of red marked its smooth whiteness. She laughed again, a little uncertainly this time. When she got home that night she found in her mail a letter for Theodore, postmarked Vienna, and stamped with the mark of the censor. Theodore had given her his word of honor that he would not write to Olga or give her his address. Olga was risking Fanny's address. She stood looking at the letter now. Theodore was coming in for dinner, as he did 5 nights out of the week. As she stood in the hallway, she heard the rattle of his key in the lock. She flew down the hall and into her bedroom, her letters in her hand. She opened her dressing table drawer and threw them into it, switched on the light, and turned to face Theodore in the doorway. "'Lo, sis." "Hello, Teddy. Kiss me." "Phew! That pipe again. How'd the work go today?" "So-so. Any mail for me?" "No." That night, when he had gone, she took out the letter and stood turning it over and over in her hands. She had no thought of reading it. It was its destruction she was contemplating. Finally, she tucked it away in her handkerchief box. Perhaps after the 15th of October. Everything depended on that. End of Part 1 of Chapter 17. Part 2 of Fanny Herself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Part 2 of Chapter 17. And the 15th of October came. It had dragged for weeks, and then at the end it galloped. By that time Fanny had got used to seeing Theodore's picture and name outside Orchestra Hall, and in the musical columns of the papers. Brandeis. Theodore Brandeis, the violinist. The name sang in her ears. When she walked on Michigan Avenue during that last week, she would force herself to march straight on past Orchestra Hall, contenting herself with a furtive and oblique glance at the announcement board. The advance programs hung, a little bundle of them, suspended by a string, from a nail on the wall near the box office, so that ticket purchasers might rip one off and peruse the week's musical menu. Fanny longed to hear the comment of the little groups that were constantly forming and dispersing about the box office window. She never dreamed of allowing herself to hover near it. She thought sometimes of the woman in the businesslike gray skirt and the black sateen apron who had drudged so cheerfully in the little shop so that Theodore Brandeis's name might shine now from the very top of the program in heavy black letters. Soloist, Mr. Theodore Brandeis, violin. The injustice of it. Fanny had never ceased to rage at that. In the years to come, Theodore Brandeis was to have that adulation which the American public, temperamentally so cold, gives its favorite, once the ice of its reserve is thawed. He was to look down on that surging, tempestuous crowd which sometimes packs itself about the foot of the platform in Carnegie Hall, demanding more, 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 after a generous concert is concluded. He had to learn to protect himself from those hysterical, enraptured, wholly feminine adorers who swarmed about him, scaling the platform itself. But of all this there was nothing on that Friday and Saturday in October. Orchestra Hall audiences are not, as a rule, wildly demonstrative. They were no exception. They listened attentively, appreciatively. They talked critically and favorably on the way home. They applauded generously. They behaved as an Orchestra Hall audience always behaves, and would behave even if it were confronted with a composite Elman Chrysler Ysaye soloist. Theodore's playing was, as a whole, perhaps the worst of his career. Not that he did not rise to magnificent heights at times, but it was what is known as uneven playing. He was torn emotionally, nervously, mentally. His playing showed it. Fanny, seated in the auditorium, her hands clasped tight, her heart hammering, had a sense of unreality as she waited for Theodore to appear from the little door at the left. He was to play after the intermission. Fanny had arrived late, with Theodore, that Friday afternoon. She felt she could not sit through the first part of the program. They waited together in the anteroom. Theodore, looking very slim and boyish in his frock coat, walked up and down, up and down. Fanny wanted to straighten his tie. She wanted to pick an imaginary thread off his lapel. She wanted to adjust the white flower in his buttonhole. He jerked it out presently, because it interfered with his violin, he said. She wanted to do any one of the foolish, futile things that would have served to relieve her own surcharged feelings. But she had learned control in these years, and she yielded to none of them. The things they said and did were, perhaps, almost ludicrous. "How do I look?" Theodore demanded, and stood up before her. "Beautiful," said Fanny, and meant it. Theodore passed a hand over his cheek. "Cut myself shaving, damn it." "It doesn't show." He resumed his pacing. Now and then he stopped, and rubbed his hands together with a motion we use in washing. Finally, "I wish you'd go out front," he said almost pettishly. Fanny rose without a word. She looked very handsome. Excitement had given her color. The pupils of her eyes were dilated, and they shone brilliantly. She looked at her brother. He stared at her. They swayed together. They kissed and clung together for a long moment. Then Fanny turned and walked swiftly away, and stumbled a little as she groped for the stairway. The bell in the foyer rang. The audience strolled to the auditorium. They lagged, Fanny thought. They crawled. She told herself that she must not allow her nerves to tease her like that. She looked about her with outward calm. Her eyes met Fenger's. He was seated alone. It was he who had got a subscription seat for her from a friend. She had said she preferred to be alone. She looked at him now, and he at her, and they did not nod nor smile. The house settled itself flutteringly. A man behind Fanny spoke. "Who's this Brandeis?" "I don't know. A new one. German, I guess. They say he's good. Chrysler's the boy who can play for me, though." The orchestra was seated now. Stock, the conductor, came out from the little side door. Behind him walked Theodore. There was a little, impersonal burst of applause. Stock mounted his conductor's platform and glanced paternally down at Theodore, who stood at the left, violin and bow in hand, bowing. The audience seemed to warm to his boyishness. They applauded again, and he bowed in a little series of jerky bobs that waggled his coat tails. Heels close together, knees close together, a German bow. And then a polite series of bobs addressed to Stock and his orchestra. Stock's long, slim hands poised in air. His fingertips seemed to draw from the men before him the first poignant strains of Theodore's concerto. Theodore stood, slim and straight. Fanny's face, lifted toward him, was a prayerful thing. Theodore suddenly jerked back the left lapel of his coat in a little movement Fanny remembered as typical in his boyish days, nuzzled his violin tenderly, and began to play. It's the most excruciating of instruments, the violin, or the most exquisite. I think Fanny actually heard very little of his playing. Her hands were icy, her cheeks were hot. The man before her was not Theodore Brandeis, the violinist, but Teddy, the bright-haired, knickered schoolboy who played to those people seated in the yellow wooden pews of the temple in Winnebago. The years seemed to fade away. He crouched over his violin to get the cello tones for which he was to become famous, and it was the same hunched, almost awkward pose that the boy had used. Fanny found herself watching his feet as he shifted his position. He was nervous, and he was not taken out of himself. She knew that because she saw the play of his muscles about the jawbone. It followed that he was not playing his best. She could not tell that from listening to him. Her music sense was dulled. She got it from these outward signs. The woman next to her was reading a program absorbedly, turning the pages regularly and with care. Fanny could have killed her with her two hands. She tried to listen detachedly. The music was familiar to her. Theodore had played it for her again and again. The last movement had never failed to shake her emotionally. It was the glorious and triumphant cry of a people tried and unafraid. She heard it now, unmoved. And then Theodore was bowing his little jerky bows, and he was shaking hands with Stock and with the first violin. He was gone. Fanny sat with her hands in her lap. The applause continued. Theodore appeared again, bowed. He bent very low now, with his arms hanging straight. There was something gracious and courtly about him, and foreign. He must keep that, Fanny thought. They like it. She saw him off again. More applause. Encores were against the house rules. She knew that. Then it meant they were pleased. He was to play again. A group of Hungarian dances this time. They were wild, gypsy things, rising to frenzy at times. He played them with spirit and poetry. To listen sent the blood singing through the veins. Fanny found herself thinking clearly and exaltedly. This is what my mother drudged for, and died for, and it was worth it. And you must do the same if necessary. Nothing else matters. What he needs now is luxury. He's worn out with fighting. Ease, peace, leisure. You've got to give them to him. It's no use, Fanny. You lose. In that moment she reached a mark in her spiritual career that she was to outdistance but once. Theodore was bowing again. Fanny had scarcely realized that he had finished. The concert was over. The group of dances, the man behind her was saying as he helped the girl next to him with her coat. But I didn't like that first thing. Church music, not concert. Fanny found her way back to the anteroom. Theodore was talking to the conductor and one or two others. He looked tired, and his eyes found Fanny's with appeal and relief in them. She came over to him. There were introductions, congratulations. Fanny slipped her hand over his with a firm pressure. Come, dear, you must be tired. At the door they found Fenger waiting. Theodore received his well-worded congratulations with an ill-concealed scowl. My car's waiting, said Fenger. Won't you let me take you home? A warning pressure from Theodore. Thanks, no. We have a car. Theodore's very tired. I can quite believe that. Not tired, growled Theodore like a great boy. I'm hungry. Starved. I never eat before playing." Kurt Stein, Theodore's manager, had been hovering over him solicitously. "You must remember tomorrow night. I should advise you to rest now as quickly as possible." He, too, glared at Fenger. Fenger fell back almost humbly. "I've great news for you. I must see you Sunday, after this is over. I'll telephone you. Don't try to come to work tomorrow." All this in a hurried aside to Fanny. Fanny nodded, and moved away with Theodore. Theodore leaned back in the car, but there was no hint of relaxation. He was as tense and vibrant as one of his own violin strings. "It went, didn't it? They're like clods, these American audiences." It was on the tip of Fanny's tongue to say that he had professed indifference to audiences, but she wisely refrained. "Gad, I'm hungry. What makes this Fenger hang around so? I'm going to tell him to keep away some day, the way he stares at you. Let's go somewhere tonight, Fan, or have some people in. I can't sit about after I've played. Olga always used to have a supper party or something." "All right, Ted. Would you like to go to the theater?" For the first time in her life she felt a little whisper of sympathy for the despised Olga. Perhaps, after all, she had not been wholly to blame. He was to leave Sunday morning for Cleveland, where he would play Monday. He had insisted on taking Mizzy with him, though Fanny had railed and stormed. Theodore had had his way. "She's used to it. She likes to travel, don't you, Mizzy? You should have seen her in Russia, and all over Germany, and in Sweden. She's a better traveler than her dad." Saturday morning's papers were kind but cool. They used words such as promising, uneven, overambitious, gifted. Theodore crumbled the lot into a ball and hurled them across the room, swearing horribly. Then he smoothed them out, clipped them, and saved them carefully. His playing that night was tinged with bravado, and the Saturday evening audience rose to it. There was about his performance a glow, a spirit that had been lacking on the previous day. Inconsistently enough, he missed the antagonism of the European critics. He was puzzled and resentful. "They hardly say a word about the meaning of the concerto. They accept it as a piece of music, Jewish in theme. It might as well have been entitled Springtime." "This isn't France or Russia," said Fanny. "Antagonism here isn't religious. It's personal, almost. You've been away so many years you've forgotten. They don't object to us as a sect or a race, but as a type. That's the trouble, Clarence Hale says. We're free to build as many synagogues as we like, and worship in them all day if we want to. But we don't want to. The struggle isn't racial anymore, but individual. For some reason or other, one flashy, loud-talking Hebrew in a restaurant can cause more ill feeling than 10,000 of them holding a religious mass meeting in Union Square." Theodore pondered a moment. "Then here each one of us is responsible. Is that it?" "I suppose so." "But look here. I've been here 10 weeks, and I've met your friends, and not one of them is a Jew. How's that?" Fanny flushed a little. "Oh, it just worked out that way." Theodore looked at her hard. "You mean you worked it out that way?" "Yes." "Fan, we're a couple of weaklings, both of us, to have sprung from a mother like ours. I don't know which is worse, my selfishness or yours." Then, at the hurt that showed in her face, he was all contrition. "Forgive me, sis. You've been wonderful to me, and to Mizzy, and to all of us. I'm a good-for-nothing fiddler, that's all. You're the strong one." Fenger had telephoned her on Saturday. He and his wife were at their place in the country. Fanny was to take the train out there Sunday morning. She looked forward to it with a certain relief. The weather had turned unseasonably warm, as Chicago Octobers sometimes do. Up to the last moment she had tried to shake Theodore's determination to take Mizzy and Otti with him, but he was stubborn. "I've got to have her," he said. Michael Fenger's voice over the telephone had been as vibrant with suppressed excitement as Michael Fenger's dry, hard tones could be. "Fanny, it's done. Finished," he said. "We had a meeting today. This is my last month with Haynes Cooper." "But you can't mean it. Why, you are Haynes Cooper. How can they let you go?" "I can't tell you now. We'll go over it all tomorrow. I've new plans. They've bought me out, do you see? At a price that, well, I thought I'd got used to juggling millions at Haynes Cooper, but this surprised even me. Will you come? Early? Take the 8:10. "That's too early. I'll get the 10." The mid-October country was a lovely thing. Fanny, with the strains of Theodore's debut and leave-taking behind her, and the prospect of a high-tension business talk with Fenger ahead, drank in the beauty of the wayside woods gratefully. Fenger met her at the station. She had never seen him so boyish, so exuberant. He almost pranced. "Hop in," he said. He had driven down in a runabout. "Brother get off all right?" "Gad, he can play. And you've made the whole thing possible." He turned to look at her. "You're a wonder." "In your present frame of mind and state of being," laughed Fanny, "you'd consider any one a wonder. You're so pleased with yourself, you're fairly gummy." Fenger laughed softly and sped the car on. They turned in at the gate. There was scarlet salvia now to take the place of the red geraniums. The gay awnings, too, were gone. "This is our last week," Fenger explained. "It's too cold out here for Katherine. We're moving into town tomorrow. We're more or less camping out here, with only the Jap to take care of us." "Don't apologize, please. I'm just grateful to be here after the week I've had. Let's have the news now." "We'll have lunch first. I'm afraid you'll have to excuse Katherine. She probably won't be down for lunch." The Jap had spread the luncheon table on the veranda, but a brisk lake breeze had sprung up, and he was busy now transferring his table from the porch to the dining room. "Would you have believed it," said Fenger, "when you left town? Good old lake. Mrs. Fenger coming down?" to the man. The Jap shook his head. "Nossa." Their talk at luncheon was all about Theodore and his future. Fenger said that what Theodore needed was a firm and guiding hand. A sort of combination manager and slave driver. An ambitious and intelligent wife would do it. That's what we all need. A woman to work for and to make us work. Fanny smiled. "Mizzy will have to be woman enough, I'm afraid. Poor Ted." They rose. "Now for the talk," said Fenger. But the telephone had sounded shrilly a moment before, and the omnipresent little Jap summoned Fenger. He was back in a minute, frowning. "It's Haynes. I'm sorry. I'm afraid it'll take a half hour of telephoning. Don't you want to take a cat nap, or stroll down to the lake?" "Don't bother about me. I'll probably take a run outdoors." "Be back in half an hour." But when she returned he was still at the telephone. She got a book and stretched luxuriously among the cushions of one of the great lounging chairs, and fell asleep. When she awoke, Fenger was seated opposite her. He was not reading. He was not smoking. He evidently had been sitting there, looking at her. "Oh, gracious! Mouth open?" "No." Fanny fought down an impulse to look as cross as she felt. "What time? Why didn't you wake me?" The house was very quiet. She patted her hair deftly, straightened her collar. "Where's everybody? Isn't Mrs. Fenger down yet?" "No. Don't you want to hear about my plans now?" "Of course I do. That's what I came for. I don't see why you didn't tell me hours ago. You're as slow in action as a Chinese play. Out with it." Fenger got up and began to pace the floor, not excitedly, but with an air of repression. He looked very powerful and compelling, there in the low-ceilinged, luxurious room. "I'll make it brief. We met yesterday in Haynes's office. Of course we had discussed the thing before. You know that. Haynes knew that I'd never run the plant under the new conditions. Why, it would kill every efficiency rule I've ever made. Here I had trimmed that enormous plant down to fighting weight. There wasn't a useless inch or ounce about the whole enormous billionaire bulk of it. And then to have Haynes come along, with his burdensome notions and his socialistic slop. They'd cripple any business, no matter how great a start it had. I told him all that. We didn't waste much time on argument, though. We knew we'd never get together. In half an hour we were talking terms. You know my contract and the amount of stock I hold. Well, we threshed that out, and Haynes is settling for $2.5 million. He came to a stop before Fanny's chair. $2.5 million what?" asked Fanny feebly. "Dollars." He smiled rather grimly. "In a check." "One check?" "One check." Fanny digested that in her orderly mind. "I thought I was used to thinking in millions. But this I'd like to touch the check just once." "You shall." He drew up a chair near her. "Now get this, Fanny. There's nothing that you and I can't do with $2.5 million. Nothing. We know this mail order game as no two people in the world know it. And it's in its infancy. I know the technical side of it. You know the human side of it. I tell you that in 5 years' time you and I can be a national power. Not merely the heads of a prosperous mail order business, but figures in finance. See what's happened to Haynes Cooper in the last 5 years. Why, it's incredible. It's grotesque. And it's nothing to what you and I can do, working together. You know people, somehow. You've a genius for sensing their wants or feelings or emotions. I don't know just what it is. And I know facts. and we have 2,500,000, and I can make it nearly 3 millions to start with. Haynes 15 years ago had a couple of 100,000. In 5 years we can make the Haynes Cooper organization look as modern and competent as a crossroads store. This isn't a dream. These are facts. You know how my mind works, like a cold chisel. I can see this whole country, and Europe too after the war, God yes, stretched out before us like a patient before expert surgeons. You to attend to its heart, and I to its bones and ligaments. I can put you where no other woman has ever been. I've 100 new plans this minute, and 100 more waiting to be born. So have you. I tell you it's just a matter of buildings, of bricks and stone and machinery and people to make the machinery go. Once we get those, and it's only a matter of months, we can accomplish things I daren't even dream of. What was Haynes Cooper 15 years ago? What was the North American Cloak and Suit Company? The Peter Johnston Stores of New York? Wells Kaiser? Nothing. They didn't exist. And this year Haynes Cooper is declaring a 25% dividend. Do you get what that means? But of course you do. That's the wonder of it. I never need explain things to you. You've a genius for understanding. Fanny had been sitting back in her chair, crouching almost, her eyes fixed upon the man's face, so terrible in its earnestness and indomitable strength. When he stopped talking now and stood looking down at her, she rose too, her eyes still on his face. She was twisting the fingers of one hand in the fingers of the other, in a frightened sort of way. I'm not really a businesswoman. Wait a minute, please. I have a knack of knowing what people are thinking and wanting. But that isn't business. It isn't, eh? It's the finest kind of business sense. It's the thing the bugs call psychology. And it's as necessary today as capital was yesterday. You can get along without the last. You can't without the first. One can be acquired. The other you've got to be born with. But of late, it's only the human side of it that has appealed to me. I don't know why. I seem to have lost interest in the actual mechanics of it. Fenger stood looking at her, his head lowered. A scarlet stripe that she had never noticed before seemed to stand out suddenly like a welt on his forehead. Then he came toward her. She raised her hand in a little futile gesture. She took an involuntary step backward, encountered the chair she had just left, and sank into it coweringly. She sat there, looking up at him, fascinated. His hand on the wing of the great chair was shaking. So, too, was his voice. Fanny, Katherine's not here. Fanny still looked up at him, wordlessly. Katherine left here yesterday. She's in town. Then at the look in her face. She was here when I telephoned you yesterday. Late yesterday afternoon she had one of her fantastic notions. She insisted that she must go into town. It was too cold for her here, too damp, well, she went. And I let her go. And I didn't telephone you again. I wanted you to come. Fanny Brandeis, knowing him, must have felt a great qualm of terror and helplessness. But she was angry, too, a wholesome ingredient in a situation such as this. The thing she said and did now was inspired. She laughed, a little uncertainly, it is true, but still she laughed, and she said, in a matter-of-fact tone, "Well, I must say that's a rather shabby trick. Still, I suppose the tired businessman has got to have his little melodrama. What do I do? Beat my breast and howl, or pound on the door panel?" Fenger stood looking at her. "Don't laugh at me, Fanny." She stood up, still smiling. It was a rather brilliant piece of work. Fenger, taken out of himself though he was, still was artist enough to appreciate it. "Why not laugh," she said, "if I'm amused? And I am. Come now, Mr. Fenger, be serious. And let's get back to the billions. I want to catch the 5:15. "I am serious." "Well, if you expect me to play the hunted heroine, I'm sorry." She pointed an accusing finger at him. "I know now. You're quitting Haynes Cooper for the movies, and this is a rehearsal for a vampire film." "You nervy little devil, you!" He reached out with one great, irresistible hand and gripped her shoulder. "You wonderful, glorious girl!" The hand that gripped her shoulder swung her to him. She saw his face with veins she had never noticed before standing out, in knots, on his temples, and his eyes were fixed and queer. And he was talking rather incoherently and rapidly. He was saying the same thing over and over again. "I'm crazy about you. I've been looking for a woman like you all my life. I'm crazy about you. I'm crazy." And then Fanny's fine composure and self-control fled, and she thought of her mother. She began to struggle, too, and to say, like any other girl, "Let me go! Let me go! You're hurting me! Let me go! You. And then, quite clearly, from that part of her brain where it had been tucked away until she should need it, came Clarence Hale's whimsical bit of advice. Her mind released it now, complete. If you double your fist this way, and tuck your thumb alongside like that, and aim for this spot, right here, about 2 inches this side of the chin, bringing your arm back and up quickly like a piston, the person you hit will go down limp. There's a nerve right here that communicates with the brain. The blow makes you see stars and bright lights. She went limp in his arms. She shut her eyes flutteringly. All men like you have a yellow streak, she whispered, and opened her eyes and looked up at him, smiling a little. He relaxed his hold in surprise and relief. And with her eyes on that spot, barely 2 inches to the side of the chin, she brought her right arm down, slowly, slowly, fist doubled, and then up like a piston, snap! His teeth came together with a sharp little crack. His face, in that second, was a comic mask. Surprised, stunned, almost idiotic. Then he went down, as Clarence Hale had predicted, limp. Not with a crash, but slowly, crumpingly, so that he almost dragged her with him. Fanny stood looking down at him a moment. Then she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. She walked out of the room and down the hall. She saw the little Jap dart suddenly back from a doorway, and she stamped her foot and said, "Scat!" as if he had been a rat. She gathered up her hat and bag from the hall table, and so out of the door and down the walk to the road. And then she began to run. She ran and ran and ran. It was the longest stretch to the pretty vine-covered station. She seemed unconscious of fatigue or distance. She must have been at least a half hour on the way. When she reached the station, the ticket agent told her there was no train until 6. So she waited quietly. She put on her hat. She had carried it in her hand all the way, and patted her hair into place. When the train came, she found a seat quite alone, and sank into its corner, and rested her head against her open palm. It was not until then that she felt a stab of pain. She looked at her hand, and saw that the skin of her knuckles was bruised and bleeding. Well, if this, she said to herself, isn't the most idiotic thing that ever happened to a woman outside a near novel. She looked at her knuckles critically, as though the hand belonged to someone else. Then she smiled. And even as she smiled, a great lump came into her throat, and the bruise blurred before her eyes, and she was crying rackingly, relievedly, huddled there in her red plush corner. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Fanny Herself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Chapter 18. It was 8 o'clock when she let herself into her apartment. She had given the maid a whole holiday. When Fanny had turned on the light in her little hallway, she stood there a moment, against the door, her hands spread flat against the panel. It was almost as though she patted it, lovingly, gratefully. Then she went on into the living room, and stood looking at its rosy lamplight. Then, still as though seeing it all for the first time, into her own quiet, cleanly bedroom, with its cream enamel, and the chaise lounge that she had cushioned in rose because it contrasted so becomingly with her black hair. And there on her dressing table, propped up against the brushes and bottles, was the yellow oblong of a telegram. From Theodore, of course. She opened it with a rush of happiness. It was like a loving hand held out to her in need. It was a day letter. We sail Monday on the St. Paul. Mizzy is with me. I broke my word to you, but you lied to me about the letters. I found them the week before the concert. I shall bring her back with me, or stay to fight for Germany. Forgive me, dear sister. Just 50 words, his thrifty German training. No! Cried Fanny aloud. No! No! And the cry quavered and died away, and another took its place, and it too gave way to another, so that she was moaning as she stood there with the telegram in her shaking hand. She read it again, her lips moving, as old people sometimes read. Then she began to whimper, with her closed fist over her mouth, her whole body shaking. All her fine courage gone now, all her rigid self-discipline, all her iron determination. She was not a tearful woman, and she had wept much on the train. So the thing that wrenched and shook her now was all the more horrible because of its soundlessness. She walked up and down the room, pushing her hair back from her forehead with the flat of her hand. From time to time she smoothed out the crumpled yellow slip of paper and read it again. Her mind, if you could have seen into it, would have presented a confused and motley picture. Something like this. But his concert engagements. That was what had happened to Bauer. How silly he had looked when her fist met his jaw. It had turned cold. Why didn't they have steam on? The middle of October. Teddy, how could you do it? How could you do it? Was he still lying on a heap on the floor? But of course the sneaking little Jap had found him. Somebody to talk to. That was what she wanted. Someone to talk to. Someone to talk to. She stood there in the middle of her lamp-lighted living room, and she held out her hands in silent appeal. Someone to talk to. In her mind she went over the list of those whose lives had touched hers in the last few crowded years. Fenger, Fascinating Facts, Ella Monahan, Nathan Haynes, all the gay, careless men and women she had met from time to time through Fenger and Fascinating Facts. Not one of them could she turn to now. Clarence Hale. She breathed a sigh of relief. Clarence Hale. He had helped her once today, and now for the second time something that he had said long ago came from its hiding place in her subconscious mind. She had said, "Some days I feel I've got to walk out of the office and down the street without a hat, and on, walking and walking, and running till I come to the horizon." And Hale had answered in his quiet, reassuring way, "Some day that feeling will get too strong for you. When that time comes, get on a train marked Denver. From there, take another to Estes Park. That's the Rocky Mountains, where the horizon lives and has its being. Ask for Hale's place. They'll hand you from one to the other. I may be there, but more likely I shan't. The key's in the mailbox, tied to a string. You'll find a fire laid with fat pine knots. My books are there. The bedding's in the cedar chest, and the mountains will make you clean and whole again, and the pines—" Fanny went to the telephone. Trains for Denver. She found the road she wanted and asked for information. She was on her own ground here. All her life she had had to find her own trains, check her own trunks, plan her journeys. Sometimes she had envied the cotton wool woman who had had all these things done for them, always. One half of her mind was working clearly and coolly. The other half was numb. There were things to be done. They would take a day. More than a day, but she would neglect most of them. She must notify the office. There were tickets to be got, reservations, money at the bank, packing. When the maid came in at 11, Fanny had suitcases and bags out, and her bedroom was strewn with shoes, skirts, coats. Late Monday afternoon, Fenger telephoned. She did not answer. Then came a note from him, then a telegram. She did not read them. Tuesday found her on a train bound for Colorado. She remembered little of the first half of her journey. She had brought her books and magazines, and she must have read them, but her mind had evidently retained nothing of what she had read. She must have spent hours looking out of the window, for she remembered long afterward the endlessness and monotony of the Kansas prairies. They soothed her. She was glad there were no bits of autumnal woodland, no tantalizing vistas, nothing to break the flat and boundless immensity of it. Here was something big and bountiful and real and primal, good Kansas dirt, miles of it, miles of it. She felt she would like to get out and tramp on it, hard. "Pretty cold up there in Estes Park," the conductor had said. "Been snowing up in the mountains." She had arranged to stop in Denver only long enough to change trains. A puffy little branch line was to take her from Denver to Loveland, and there, she had been told, one of the big mountain road steam automobiles would take her up the mountains to her destination. For one as mentally alert as she normally was, the exact location of that destination was very hazy in her mind. Hale's place, that was all. Ordinarily she would have found the thought ridiculous, but she concentrated on it now, clung to it. At the first glimpse of the foothills, Fanny's listless gaze became interested. If you have ever traveled on the jerky, cleanly, meandering little road that runs between Denver and the park, You know that it winds and curves, so that the mountains seem to leap about friskily, first confronting you on one side of the car window, then disappearing and seeming to taunt you from the windows of the opposite side. Fanny laughed aloud. The mountain steam car was waiting at Loveland. There were few passengers at this time of year. The driver was a great tanned giant, pongee-colored from his hair to his puttees and boots. Fanny was to learn later that in Estes Park the male tourist was likely to be puny, pallid, and unattractive when compared to the tall, slim, straight, khaki-clad youth, browned by the sun and the wind and the dust, who drives his steamer up and down the perilous mountain roads with more dexterity than the charioteering gods ever displayed on Olympus. Fanny got the seat beside this glorious person. The steamer was a huge vehicle, boasting 5 rows of seats, and looking very much like a small edition of the sightseeing cars one finds in tourist-infested cities. "Hale's place," said Fanny. "Suppose it failed to work?" Said the blond god, "Stoppin' at the inn overnight, I s'pose." "Why, I don't know," faltered Fanny. "Can't I go right on to Hale's place?" "Can. Mountain steamer men are not loquacious." "Sure. Better not. You won't get to the inn till dark. Better stay there overnight, and go on up to Hale's place in the morning." Then he leaned forward, clawed about expertly among what appeared to Fanny's eyes to be a maze of handles, brakes, valves, and the great car glided smoothly off, without a bump, without a jar. Fanny took a long breath. There is no describing a mountain. One uses words, and they are futile. And the Colorado Rockies in October, when the aspens are turning. Well, aspens turn gold in October. People who have seen an aspen grove in October believe in fairies. And such people need no clumsy descriptive passages to aid their fancies. You others who have not seen it? There shall be no poor weaving together of words. There shall be no description of orange and mauve and flame-colored sunsets, no juggling with mists and clouds and sunrises and purple mountains. Mountain dwellers and mountain lovers are a laconic tribe. They know the futility of words. But the effect of the mountains on Fanny Brandeis, that is within our province. In the first place, they made her hungry. That was the crisp, heady air. The mountain road, to one who has never traveled it, is a thing of delicious thrills and near terror. A narrow, perilous ribbon of road, cut in the side of the rock itself. A road all horseshoe curves and hairpin twists. Fanny found herself gasping, but that passed after a time. Big Thompson Canyon leaves no room for petty terror. And the pongee person was so competent, so quietly sure, so angularly graceful among his brakes and levers. Fanny stole a side glance at him now and then. He looked straight ahead. When you drive a mountain steamer, you do look straight ahead. A glance to right or left is so likely to mean death, or at best a sousing in the Thompson that foams and rushes below. Fanny ventured a question. "Do you know Mr. Hale?" "Hale? Took him down day before yesterday." "Down?" "To the village. He's gone back east." Fanny was not quite sure whether the pang she felt was relief or consternation. At Estes village the blond god handed her over to a twin charioteer who would drive her up the mountain road to the inn that nestled in a valley 9,000 feet up the mountain. It was a drive Fanny never forgot. Fenger, Ted, Haynes Cooper, her work, her plans, her ambitions, seemed to dwindle to puny insignificance beside the vast grandeur that unfolded before her at every fresh turn in the road. Up they went, and up, and the air was cold but without a sting in it. It was dark when the lights of the inn twinkled out at them. The door was thrown open as they swung up the curve to the porch. A great log fire glowed in the fireplace. The dining room held only a dozen people, or thereabouts, a dozen weary, healthy people, in corduroys and sweaters and boots, whose cleanly talk was all about climbing and fishing and horseback rides and trails. And it was fried chicken night at the inn. Fanny thought she was too utterly tired to eat, until she began to eat, and then she thought she was too hungry ever to stop. After dinner she sat, for a moment, before the log fire in the low-ceilinged room, with its log walls, its rustic benches, and its soft-toned green and brown cushions. She forgot to be unhappy. She forgot to be anything but deliciously drowsy, and presently she climbed the winding stair whose newel post was a fire-marked tree trunk, richly colored and curiously twisted. And so to her lamp-lighted room, very small, very clean, very quiet. She opened her window and looked out at the towering mass that was Long's Peak, and at the stars, and she heard the busy little brook that scurries through the inn yard on its way from the mountain to the valley. She undressed quickly and crept into bed, meaning to be very, very miserable indeed. And the next thing she knew it was morning, a blue and gold October morning. And the mountains! But there is no describing a mountain. One uses words, and they are futile. Fanny viewed them again from her window, between pauses in dressing. And she meant, privately, to be miserable again. But she could only think, somehow, of bacon and eggs, and coffee, and muffins. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Fanny Herself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Chapter 19. Hale's place. Fanny stood before it, key in hand. She had found it in the mailbox, tied to a string. And she had a curious and restful feeling, as if she had come home after long wanderings. She smiled whimsically and repeated her lesson to herself. The fire's laid in the fireplace with fat pine knots that will blaze up at the touch of a match. My books are there, along the wall. The bedding's in the cedar chest, and the lamps are filled. There's tin stuff in the pantry, and the mountains are there, girl, to make you clean and whole again. She stepped up to the little log-pillared porch and turned the key in the lock. She opened the door wide and walked in. And then she shut her eyes for a moment, because if it shouldn't be true... But there was a fire laid with fat pine knots. She walked straight over to it and took her box of matches from her bag, struck one, and held it to the wood. They blazed like a torch. Books! Along the four walls, books. Fat, comfortable, used-looking books. Hundreds of them. A lamp on the table, and beside it a pipe, blackened from much use. Fanny picked it up, smiling. She held it a moment in her hand, as though she expected to find it still warm. It's like one of the fairy tales, she thought, the kind that repeats and repeats. The kind that says, and she went into the next room, and it was as the good fairy had said. There's tin stuff in the pantry. She went into the tiny kitchen and opened the pantry door cautiously, being wary of mice. But it met her eye in spotless array. Orderly rows of tins, orderly rows of bottles. Coffee, condensed milk, beans, spaghetti, flour, peaches, pears. Off the bedroom there was an absurdly adequate little bathroom, with a zinc tub and an elaborate water heating arrangement. Fanny threw back her head and laughed as she hadn't laughed in months. "Wild life in the Rockies," she said aloud. She went back to the book-lined living room. The fire was crackling gloriously. It was a many-windowed room, and each window framed an enchanting glimpse of mountain, flaming with aspens up to the timberline and snow-capped at the top. Fanny decided to wait until the fire had died down to a coal bed. Then she banked it carefully, put on a heavy sweater and a cap, and made for the outdoors. She struck out briskly, tenderfoot that she was. In 5 minutes she was panting. Her heart was hammering suffocatingly. Her lungs ached. She stopped, trembling. Then she remembered. The altitude, of course. Hale had boasted that his cabin stood at an altitude of over 9,000 feet. Well, she would have to get used to it. But she was soon striding forward as briskly as before. She was a natural mountain dweller. The air, the altitude, speeded up her heart, her lungs, sent the blood dancing through her veins. Figuratively, she was on tiptoe. They had warned her at the inn to take it slowly for the first few days. They had asked no questions. Fanny learned to heed their advice. She learned many more things in the next few days. She learned how to entice the chipmunks that crossed her path, streak of sunshine, streak of shadow. She learned to broil bacon over a fire with a forked stick. She learned to ride trail ponies, and to bask in a sun-warmed spot on a wind-swept hill, and to tell time by the sun, and to give thanks for the beauty of the world about her, and to leave the wild flowers unpicked, to put out her campfire with scrupulous care, and to destroy all rubbish. Your true woodsman and mountaineer is as painstakingly neat as a French housewife. She was out of doors all day. At night she read for a while before the fire, but by 9 her eyelids were heavy. She walked down to the inn sometimes, but not often. One memorable night she went, with half a dozen others from the inn, to the tiny one-room cabin of Oscar, the handy man about the inn, and there she listened to one of Oscar's far-famed phonograph concerts. Oscar's phonograph had cost $25 in Denver. It stood in one corner of his cabin, and its base was a tree stump just 500 years old, as you could tell for yourself by counting its rings. His cabin walls were gorgeous with pictures of Maxine Elliott in her palmy days, and blonde and sophisticated little girls on vinegar calendars, posing bare-legged and self-conscious in blue calico and sunbonnets. You sat in the warm yellow glow of Oscar's lamp, and were regaled with everything from the sweetest national anthem to Mishka Elman's tenderest crooning. And Oscar sat rapt, his weather-beaten face a rich, deep mahogany, his eyes bluer than any eyes could ever be except in contrast with that ruddy countenance, his teeth so white that you found yourself watching for his smile that was so gently sweet and childlike. So when Oscar put on his black pants and issued invitations for a musical evening, one was sure to find his cabin packed. 8 did it, with squeezing. This, then, was the atmosphere in which Fanny Brandeis found herself, as far from Haynes Cooper as anything could be. At the end of the first week she found herself able to think clearly and unemotionally about Theodore and about Fenger. She had even evolved a certain rather crude philosophy out of the ruins that had tumbled about her ears. It was so crude, so unformed in her mind, that it can hardly be set down. To justify one's own existence. That was all that life held or meant. But that included all the lives that touched on yours. It had nothing to do with success, as she had counted success heretofore. It was service, really. It was living as Molly Brandeis had lived, helpfully, self-effacingly, magnificently. Fanny gave up trying to form the thing that was growing in her mind. Perhaps, after all, it was too soon to expect a complete understanding of that which had worked this change in her from that afternoon in Fenger's library. After the first few days she found less and less difficulty in climbing. Her astonished heart and lungs ceased to object so strenuously to the unaccustomed work. The cabin rock trail, for example, whose summit found her panting and exhausted at first, now seemed a mere stroll. She grew more daring and ambitious. One day she climbed the Longs Peak Trail to Timberline and had tea at Timberline Cabin with Albert Edward Cobbins. Albert Edward Cobbins, Englishman, erstwhile sailor, adventurer, and gentleman, was the keeper of Timberline Cabin, and the loneliest man in the Rockies. It was his duty to house overnight climbers bound for the peak, sunrise parties and sunset parties, all too few now in the chill October season end. Fanny was his first visitor in 3 days. He was pathetically glad to see her. "I'll have tea for you," he said, "in a jiffy. And I baked a pan of French rolls 10 minutes ago. I had a feeling." A magnificent specimen of a man, over 6 feet tall, slim, broad-shouldered, long-headed, and scrub-looking, as only an Englishman can be. There was something almost pathetic in the sight of him bustling about the rickety little kitchen stove. "Tomorrow," said Fanny over her tea, "I'm going to get an early start, reach here by noon, and go on to Boulder Field, and maybe Keyhole." "Better not, miss. Not in October, when there's likely to be a snowstorm up there in a minute's notice." "You'd come and find me, wouldn't you? They always do in the books." "Books are all very well, miss, but I'm not a mountain man. The truth is, I don't know my way 50 feet from this cabin. I got the job because I'm used to loneliness, and don't mind it, and because I can cook, d'ye see? Having shipped as cook for years. But I'm a seafaring man, miss. I wouldn't advise it, miss. Another cup of tea?" But Long's Peak, king of the range, had fascinated her from the first. She knew that the climb to the summit would be impossible for her now, but she had an overwhelming desire to see the terrifying bulk of it from a point midway of the range. It beckoned her and intrigued her, as the difficult always did. By noon of the following day she had left Albert Edward's cabin. He stood looking after her in the doorway until she disappeared around the bend, and was jauntily following the trail that led to Boulder Field, that sea of jagged rock a mile across. Soon she had left the tortured, wind-twisted timberline trees far behind. How pitiful Cabin Rock and Twin Sisters looked compared to this! She climbed easily and steadily, stopping for brief rests. Early in the week she had ridden down to the village, where she had bought climbing breeches and stout leggings. She laughed at Albert Edward and his fears. By 1 o'clock she had reached Boulder Field. She found the rocks glazed with ice. Just over Keyhole, that freakish vent in a wall of rock, the blue of the sky had changed to the gray of snow clouds. Tenderfoot though she was, she knew that the climb over Boulder Field would be perilous, if not impossible. She went on, from rock to rock, for half an hour, then decided to turn back. A clap of thunder that roared and crashed and cracked up and down the canyons and over the peaks hastened her decision. She looked about her, peak on peak, purple and black and yellow masses, fantastic in their hugeness. Chasms, canyons, pyramids and minarets. And so near, so grim, so ghastly desolate, and yet so threatening. And then Fanny Brandeis was seized with mountain terror. It is a disease recognized by mountain men everywhere, and it is panic, pure and simple. It is fear brought on by the immensity and the silence of the mountains. A great horror of the vastness and ruggedness came upon her. It was colossal, it was crushing, it was nauseating. She began to run, a mistake that, when one is following a mountain trail, at best an elusive thing. In 5 minutes she had lost the trail. She stopped and scolded herself sternly, and looked about her. She saw the faint trail line again, or thought she saw it, and made toward it, and found it to be no trail at all. She knew that she must not be more than an hour's walk from Timberline Cabin and Albert Edward and his biscuits and tea. Why be frightened? It was absurd. But she was frightened, horribly, harrowingly. The great, grim rock masses seemed to be shaking with silent laughter. She began to run again. She was very cold, and a piercing wind had sprung up. She kept on walking doggedly, reasoning with herself quite calmly, and proud of her calmness, which proves how terrified she really was. Then the snow came, not slowly, not gradually, but a blanket of it, as it does come in the mountains, shutting off everything. And suddenly Fanny's terror vanished. She felt quite free from weariness. She was alive and tingling to her fingertips. The psychology of fear is a fascinating thing. Fanny had reached the second stage. She was quite taken out of herself. She forgot her stone-bruised feet. She was no longer conscious of cold. She ran now fleetly, lightly, the ground seeming to spur her on. She had given up the trail completely now. She told herself that if she ran on, down, 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 she must come to the valley sometime. Unless she was turned about and headed in the direction of one of those hideous chasms. She stopped a moment, peering through the snow curtain, but she could see nothing. She ran on, lightly, laughing a little. Then her feet met a projection. She stumbled, and fell flat over a slab of wood that jutted out of the ground. She lay there a moment, dazed. Then she sat up and bent down to look at this thing that had tripped her. Probably a tree trunk. Then she must be near timberline. She bent closer. It was a rough wooden slab. Closer still. There were words carved on it. She lay flat and managed to make them out painfully. Here lies Sarah Cannon, lay to rest and died alone. April 26, 1893. Fanny had heard the story of Sarah Cannon, a stern spinster who had achieved the climb to the peak, and who had met with mishap on the down trail. Her guide had left her to go for help. When the relief party returned, hours later, they had found her dead. Fanny sprang up, filled with a furious energy. She felt strangely light and clear-headed. She ran on, stopped, ran again. Now she was making little short runs, here and there. It was snowing furiously, vindictively. It seemed to her that she had been running for hours. It probably was minutes. Suddenly she sank down, got to her feet again, stumbled on perhaps a dozen paces, and sank down again. It was as though her knees had turned liquid. She lay there with her eyes shut. "I'm just resting," she told herself. "In a minute I'll go on. In a minute, after I've rested." "Hello!" from somewhere on the other side of the snow blanket. "Hello!" Fanny sat up, helloing shrilly, hysterically. She got to her feet staggeringly, and Clarence Hale walked toward her. "You ought to be spanked for this," he said. Fanny began to cry weakly. She felt no curiosity as to his being there. She wasn't at all sure that he actually was there, for that matter. At that thought she dug a frantic hand into his arm. He seemed to understand, for he said, "It's all right. I'm real enough. Can you walk?" "Yes." But she tried it and found she could not. She decided that she was too tired to care. "I stumbled over a thing, a horrible thing, a gravestone, and I must have hurt my leg. I didn't know." She leaned against him, a dead weight. "Tell you what," said Hale cheerfully. "You wait here. I'll go down to Timberline Cabin for help, and come back." "You couldn't manage it alone if I tried to walk?" "Oh, impossible." His tone was brisk. "Now you sit right down here." She sank down obediently. She felt a little sorry for herself, and glad, too, and queer, and not at all cold. She looked up at him dumbly. He was smiling. "All right?" She nodded. He turned abruptly. The snow hid him from sight at once. Here lies Sarah Cannon, laid to rest and died alone, April 26, 1893. She sank down and pillowed her head on her arms. She knew that this was the end. She was very drowsy and not at all sad. Happy, if anything. "You didn't really think I'd leave you, did you, Fan?" She opened her eyes. Hale was there. He reached down and lifted her lightly to her feet. "Timberline Cabin's not 100 yards away. I just did it to try you." She had spirit enough left to say, "Beast!" Then he swung her up and carried her down the trail. He carried her not in his arms as they do in books and in the movies. He could not have gone 100 feet that way. He carried her over his shoulder like a sack of meal, by one arm and one leg, I regret to say. Any Boy Scout knows that trick, and will tell you what I mean. It is the most effectual carrying method known, though unromantic. And so they came to Timberline Cabin, and Albert Edward Cobbins was in the doorway. Hale put her down gently on the bench that ran alongside the table, the hospitable table that bore 2 smoking cups of tea. Fanny's lips were cracked, and the skin was peeling from her nose, and her hair was straggling, and her eyes red-rimmed. She drank the tea in great gulps, and then she went into the tiny bunk room and tumbled into one of the shelf bunks and slept. When she awoke she sat up in terror, and bumped her head against the bunk above, and called, "Clancy!" "Yep," from the next room. He came to the door. The acrid smell of their pipes was incense in her nostrils. "Rested?" "What time is it?" 7 o'clock. Dinner time. Ham and eggs." She got up stiffly and bathed her roughened face, and produced a powder pad (they carry them in the face of danger, death, and dissolution) and dusted it over her scaly nose. She did her hair, her vigorous, abundant hair that shone in the lamplight, pulled down her blouse, surveyed her torn shoes ruefully, donned the khaki skirt that Albert Edward had magically produced from somewhere to take the place of her breeches. She dusted her shoes with a bit of rag, regarded herself steadily in the wavering mirror, and went in. The 2 men were talking quietly. Albert Edward was moving deftly from stove to table. They both looked up as she came in, and she looked at Hale. Their eyes held. Albert Edward was as sporting a gentleman as the late dear king whose name he bore. He went out to tend Hale's horse, he said. It was little he knew of horses, and he rather feared them, as does a sailing man, but he went nevertheless. Hale still looked at Fanny, and Fanny at him. "It's absurd," said Fanny. "It's the kind of thing that doesn't happen." "It's simple enough, really," he answered. "I saw Ella Monahan in Chicago, and she told me all she knew, and something of what she had guessed. I waited a few days and came back. I had to." He smiled. "A pretty job you've made of it trying to be selfish." At that she smiled, too, pitifully enough, for her lower lip trembled. She caught it between her teeth in a last sharp effort at self-control. "Don't!" she quavered. And then, in a panic, Her two hands came up in a vain effort to hide the tears. She sank down on the rough bench by the table, and the proud head came down on her arms so that there was a little clatter and tinkle among the supper things spread on the table. Then quiet. Clarence Hale stared. He stared helplessly, as does a man who has never, in all his life, been called upon to comfort a woman in tears. Then instinct came to his rescue. He made her side of the table in 2 strides. Your favorite film star couldn't have done it better. Put his 2 hands on her shoulders and neatly shifted the bowed head from the cold, hard surface of the tabletop to the warm, rough, tobacco-scented comfort of his coat. It rested there quite naturally. Just as naturally Fanny's arm crept up and about his neck. So they remained for a moment, until he bent so that his lips touched her hair. Her head came up at that, sharply, so that it bumped his chin. They both laughed, looking into each other's eyes, but at what they saw there they stopped laughing and were serious. "Dear," said Hale. "Dearest." The lids drooped over Fanny's eyes. "Look at me," said Hale. So she tried to lift them again, bravely, and could not. At that he bent his head and kissed Fanny Brandeis in the way a woman wants to be kissed for the first time by the man she loves. It hurt her lips, that kiss, and her teeth, and the back of her neck, and it left her breathless, and set things whirling. When she opened her eyes, they shut them at such times, he kissed her again, very tenderly this time, and lightly, and reassuringly. She returned that kiss, and strangely enough, it was the one that stayed in her memory long, long after the other had faded. "Oh, Clancy, I've made such a mess of it all. Such a miserable mess. The little girl in the red tam was worth 10 of me. I don't see how you can care for me." "You're the most wonderful woman in the world," said Hale, "and the most beautiful and splendid." He must have meant it, for he was looking down at her as he said it, and we know that the skin had been peeled off her nose by the mountain winds and sun, that her lips were cracked and her cheeks rough, and that she was red-eyed and worn-looking. And she must have believed him, for she brought his cheek down to hers with such a sigh of content, though she said, "But are we at all suited to each other?" "Probably not," Hale answered briskly. "That's why we're going to be so terrifically happy. Some day I'll be passing the Singer Building, and I'll glance up at it and think how pitiful it would look next to Long's Peak, and then I'll be off, probably, to these mountains." "Or some day," Fanny returned, "we'll be up here, and I'll remember suddenly how Fifth Avenue looks on a bright afternoon between 4 and 5, and I'll be off, probably, to the Grand Central Station." And then began one of those beautiful and foolish conversations which all lovers have, whose love has been a sure and steady growth. Thus: "When did you first begin to care?" etc. And, "That day we spent at the dunes, and you said so and so. Did you mean this and that?" Albert Edward Cobbins announced his approach by terrific stampings and scufflings, ostensibly for the purpose of ridding his boots of snow. He entered looking casual and very nipped. "You're here for the night," he said. "A regular blizzard. The greatest piece of luck I've had in a month." He busied himself with the ham and eggs and the teapot. "Hungry?" "Not a bit," said Fanny and Hale together. "Hm," said Albert Edward, and broke 6 eggs into the frying pan just the same. After supper they aided Albert Edward in the process of washing up. When everything was tidy, he lighted his most malignant pipe and told them seafaring yarns, not necessarily true. Then he knocked the ashes out of his pipe and fell asleep there by the fire, effacing himself as effectually as one of 3 people can in a single room. They talked low-toned murmurings that they seemed to find exquisitely meaningful or witty by turn. Fanny, rubbing a forefinger, his, along her weather-roughened nose, would say, "At least you've seen me at my worst." Or he, mock serious, "I thought I ought to tell you I'm the kind of man who throws wet towels into the laundry hamper." But there was no mirth in Fanny's voice when she said, "Dear, do you think Lasker will give me that job? You know he said, 'When you want a job, come back.' Do you think he meant it?" "Lasker always means it." "But," fearfully, and shyly too, "you don't think I may have lost my drawing hand and my seeing eye, do you? As punishment?" "I do not. I think you've just found them for keeps. There wasn't a woman cartoonist in the country, or man either, for that matter, could touch you 2 years ago. In 2 more, I'll just be Fanny Brandeis's husband, that's all." They laughed together at that, so that Albert Edward Cobbins awoke with a start, and tried to look as if he had not been asleep, and failing, smiled benignly and drowsily upon them. End of Chapter 19. End of Fanny Herself, by Edna Ferber.